Hi, I'm Arthur. And I bet you didn't see this coming. It's a bit late by a few days, but for those who don't know what this is the paid content I have been creating for the last year. Basically, if you are a channel member of the current highest tier of Arthur Lord, you gain access to 2 additional videos a month, with some wiggle room for sickness and personal issues that arise from time to time. I unveiled this channel membership role last year and unveiled the ability to get this content, with the caveat of I'm not gonna make these videos public until a year after the publication. Well, I posted the first video on the 16th of August, and considering we have passed that milestone, I was left with the choice of either drip feeding you every single video until they were out and trying milking it for all it's worth, or just release all 20 parts in one compilation video and then just treat you guys with a long ass video. Because I respect your guys' time and don't want to game the system that much, I decided to make the compilation video. This video covers a bunch of out-of-nowhere chapters that I think you'd enjoy. It's a 20-part series consisting of what I deem as the most significant chapters of Space Marines that no one really talks about. There are some weird diversions from time to time, but other than that, everything in here, I like to think I explained my point as to why they're significant. And if you disagree, then don't watch the video. Scream if you want to, I'll probably hear it. I'm still in the process of deciding what to do next for Arthur Lords, but you know, we got time. We got at least another 2 weeks before I gotta publish another video for them, because if you didn't know, Arthur Lords get 2 extra videos a month. So with that being said, there are a few things I want to say before I get into this compilation. For one, I did cut off certain elements of the video. Now, it was the end stage part of each video where I thank channel members for supporting me, and it was the first part of the video where I introduced the topic of the day and discuss what series they're watching. Now, there are a few jokes that are cut out because of this, and it's also because I want to still give my Arthur Lord something that no one else will. It's so that it doesn't remove that special feeling, making it feel insignificant that I'm just going to release it a year later. So if you want to see the cut content, then, well, become an Arthur Lord. There are some pretty interesting bits that you're going to be missing out on, especially with the last part of this series where I do get a cameo from a certain someone. Secondly, it's going to be wild seeing all of these videos, as the first one was created well over a year ago, which was before I learned how to do motion graphics on my video editor. So if you think that there's a dip in quality in the beginning, that's why. So about part 10 is when things start to become more what you're used to as of right now. And lastly, man, I used to swear a lot in these things, so I might have to bleep out a few things for the first couple parts just so this video doesn't get suppressed or demonetized. So if you hear some weird noises, it's because YouTube dinged me and I have to actually keep the video down for a bit. So, yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. Take it away, younger Arthur. This is part 1 of a new 20-part series I'm going to be doing on 20 different Descendant chapters in order. It's going to be exclusive to the higher tier channel members, and the theming of it is based simply on importance to the setting. Is it a chapter that is significant or important in any way, shape, or form? I'll probably put it into this list depending on the Legion itself. So we're doing part 1, which means the first Legion, which means Dark Angels. The Descendant chapters tend to just be Dark Angels with a few extra steps added on. So when it comes to covering things of relevance, I find it's hard to find anything that isn't, ooh, they are Dark Angels, but blue. Sure, there are a few fun ones out there, but the one I think is probably the most significant to the setting is the Relictors. Fun fact about them: they are the first non-Legion-based Space Marine chapter I learned about when I got into the game. I pirated, legally procured 3 audiobooks: The Heart of Decay, The Rage of Asmodai, and The Assassination of Gabriel Seth. I listened to them all in that order. Now, The Assassination of Gabriel Seth is a fucking awesome book, but has nothing to do with the Relictors. The 2 other books I got, I didn't know had anything to do with the Relictors. I thought one was Death Guard and the other was Dark Angels. And to a degree, I was right. So color me interested when my time to cover more Space Marine chapters is at hand, and I am here to look at these silly little fellows once more. There is no goddamn way they aren't a descendant chapter of the Dark Angels, and I will get into why later. So, stick around if you want to find out. But to start, they initially were referred to as the Fire Claws, one of the 20 or so chapters of Space Marines dedicated to keeping the Eye of Terror in check at key locations. Now, if you need help remembering these Marines, they were called the Astartes Praesus, and I had an unhinged fucking meltdown about them a while back involving the Sons of Malice, which just so happened to be a member of them. Being the Fire Claws, they decided to just be a Space Marine chapter. Apparently in lore, they were very Space Marine-y. A very noble track record of support in the Imperium at large, but it's one of those literary moments where they just go, oh, they helped at the Battle of Dragonbone Thunderfuck Ridge, or they played a key role in the shortening. Basically saying they played a role in a military campaign that sounds significant, but GW desperately needs people to forget about it due to them never wanting to elaborate further. Unless it's actually in some significant place like Armageddon. Oh, also, these guys fought in one of the wars for Armageddon. So why did they go from being called the Fire Claws to the Relictors? It's pretty simple. Basically, they were called in as support for a military campaign involving a Tzeentch-corrupted warband that was so insignificant that their leader got a title, and the warband didn't even get a name in lore. Not to mention the leader's name was so fucking generic in the 40k setting, I had to essentially type the Excoriator, no, not the Space Marine chapter, to get any information about him, which is funny, because he still has slightly more information on him than the current chapter master of the fucking Imperial Fists. Fire Claws, working alongside a particularly cracked Inquisitor, fought their way through the Space Hulk that the Warband had sort of nested in, got to some kind of cool final stand type thing by the Warband that had them hold up until they all died, leaving the Excoriator. God damn it, dude, that is such a shit name. The TLDR is he had a demon-possessed sword, killed a bunch of Terminators from the Fire Claws, almost killed a named librarian for the Fire Claws. The librarian in question accidentally grabbed the demon weapon and killed him with it. He realized that, man, killing Chaos dudes with Chaos weapons is pretty fun and easy. We should do this more often, to which the Inquisitor was like, no, don't, that's such a bad idea. Which led to them rebranding their entire shtick to being about collecting Chaos relics and killing Chaos Marines with them. Thus, they renamed themselves to the Relictors. It's a cool tale, very, very heretical, unless you're the fucking Grey Knights. But they eventually got caught. I'm pretty sure the Inquisitor in question got disappeared, and they were told never to do that again. Went on a penance crusade, and if memory serves correctly, they are basically considered non-chaos traitors to the Imperium, but still work with the Imperium from time to time. It's a little weird, but I think it leads to them being one of the best factions lore-wise to have any kind of novels about them. Follow me on this. They are enacting upon dozens of different campaigns, each one dedicated to solving a problem involving chaos without the fear of corruption from chaos. Good example, they have a captured Death Guard Plague Marine in a Dreadnought sarcophagus that they sealed away. The sarcophagus is in a secluded section of space with only ever one Space Marine apothecary at this massive monastery at any given time. Every couple of years, that Marine becomes corrupted by chaos. They send in a new apothecary, kill the old one, replace him, and do more experiments. What are they trying to do? Cure Nurgle's rot. Dog, that is impossible but awesome. They are outside of the Imperium, but work towards a greater good to help it, which makes them like the chaotic good protagonist of 40k that, in all honesty, it kind of needs. Before I close off, I want to elaborate on why I believe they are a Dark Angel's successor, true and blue. In the Rage of Asmodai, Asmodai is tracking down what he thinks is a fallen Dark Angel, which is what he does best, after all. He will kill, torture, and God knows what else to anyone who gets in his way. On the same planet, there is a Relictor captain trying to acquire a demon weapon this Marine has. They both end up in a position of crossing paths, where they find out the Black Space Marine is just a Black Legionnaire and not a Fallen, if I remember correctly. For the help from the Relictor in securing this man, Asmodai gives him the demon weapon and doesn't lobotomize him. Now, if you know anything about Asmodai, he's kind of a mean guy. Putting it lightly, I know, but for him to not lobotomize you when you are this close to knowing about the Fallen basically guarantees that you are a Dark Angel. I remember even in lore, he caught a Dark Angel in the 2nd Company barracks laughing. So he commanded for 1 year that no one is allowed to speak in that exact barracks. He will turn Space Marines into servitors for being on the same planet as someone who has a connection to the Fallen. So for him to give lenience here, it only makes sense for them to be of Dark Angel's gene stock. So that is a kind of rough overview of the Relictors. Do you like secrets? Do you like having chaos weapons but not being a pussy whip bitch controlled by the dark gods? Do you like spray painting your miniatures gray and then calling it a fucking day? Then maybe try out the Relictors. They are a really cool option for people wanting to try new Marines. And if you throw in some Dark Angel specific miniature stuff, then I could see the army composition being pretty fucking cool. So, part 2 was a particularly difficult one for me to script or to decide upon, because if you didn't know, there isn't a 2nd or 11th Legion. So considering something had to cover this specific spot, I have to be careful that whatever I choose can't be fully traced back to another Legion with a very sound principle behind it, or make myself sound as cracked as humanly possible. So, instead of choosing one chapter with unknown origins, let's choose a theoretical chapter that has all of the Legions as its own origin. Confused yet? I fucking hope so. So, let's break it down a bit. When Rabute Guilliman was woken up by Eldar and Call being Call, he was given a massive army that was essentially Legion-sized from the old days when he was actually conscious. Call, being Call, made thousands of new Space Marines that have the gene seed of every Primarch that was collected on the vaults of Terra. Yes, all of them. Guilliman was likely lied to. Conspiracy aside, this Legion that was created was a mixture of every Loyalist gene seed imaginable, separated based on task. So you all have small squads of Blood Angels and Space Wolves as melee specialists, and you have Iron Hands and Imperial Fists as gunnery experts. This massive legion of ultra-diverse skill sets ended up working together to form the backbone of the Indomitus Crusade. They went by many different names, but the one most people know them by is either the Unnumbered Sons of Guilliman or the Grey Shields. Being called the Grey Shields because they have a small gray marking on their armor regardless of where their gene stock came from to denote which legion they belong to. It was a small gray chevron to denote that they are all working together for the same purpose. It's simple stuff, so the Indomitus Crusade ended up working together with all of these Marines to stop various threats. Usually just chaosy goodness that was causing a massive fucking kerfuffle around the universe. They are featured pretty predominantly in the Dark Imperium series, where they are fighting against the Death Guard for the majority of it. And doing a decent job. There is a lot that could be explored with these Marines that isn't really touched upon, and sadly to my recollection, they no longer exist. I'll get into why in like a few minutes, but A few interesting lore tidbits that happened is that through the perspective of the Grey Shields, you learn a lot about how Primaris Marines react and interact with their firstborn brothers, as well as how Primaris Marines interact with Chaos. Even in the first book, there was a Primaris Marine that was, like, slowly being influenced by Chaos before another Marine was like, "Dog, calm down, you're scaring the hoes." To which the Marine in question goes, "Oh shit, you're right." And he goes back to doing what he was doing, which, if I remember correctly, was murder. The term Grey Shields is obviously a callback to the Black Shields of the Horus Heresy, but that is a topic for another time. I mean, I have to have something lined up for the 11th chapter video anyhow, eh? They served under the Indomitus Crusade as a sort of 3-part plan. Part 1, give the boyos who were frozen for thousands of years some actual combat experience so they aren't just overwhelmed immediately upon coming out of their pod. Part 2, have a legion-sized army in order to scare that punk bitch Mortarion back into his little moth hidey hole where he f***ing deserves to be. And Part 3, eventually, part ways with the Marines so they can reinforce other Space Marine chapters, which is where we get into why the Grey Shields are more or less no longer a thing. The Indomitus Crusade lasted, I believe, over 100 years or so. I think 130 was the total. And through that time, all of these unnumbered sons fought to serve the crusade. But once it was over, as declared by Guilliman himself, they were all dispersed as per the amended Codex Astartes, dictated across the universe to either reinforce previously existing chapters, by the way, rip the fucking flesh terrors, or create new chapters that will serve as guardians in key locations. There's actually a tidbit in the lore where you learn they couldn't get Primaris Marines from these unnumbered sons to certain locations, usually in the Imperium Nihilus, which, if you don't know what that is, imagine the entire universe got ripped in two, and on one side you have the Imperium of Mankind as well as, the Emperor of Mankind, and the other side has neither and is kind of fucked right now. So suffice to say, they couldn't get Marines over there. So what happened is they sent the data on how to make the new Primaris Marines that were part of the Unnumbered Sons out of the current gene stock that they had, as well as schematics for Mark 10 Indomitus pattern armor. In the Spears of the Emperor, it turns out that the first couple batches of Primaris Marines they tried to make turned out deformed, or more or less were killed on the spot if they didn't die from some horrible contortion-based death. Unless your name was Saravan, but whatever. It wasn't an easily accomplished goal trying to get every one Primaris Marine so that they could be reinforced, and even the creation of these new sons from scratch is incredibly difficult for those who never got to see them in person. For the 100 or so chapters that were erected, you saw so many interesting things happen because these individuals knew how to make them, so there wasn't that awkward step of having to form Space Marines, like the Wolf Spear, which I have already covered being one of the only Space Wolf descendant chapters around. You also have like the Dark Krakens, which are water-based salamanders and have a goddamn cool paint scheme. I am not immune to black and purple, sorry. You also have the Sons of the Phoenix, which are totally of Dorn's gene heritage. Totally. Don't even get me started on the Covenant of Fire. Each of these new chapters were created to guard key locations or serve a specific purpose. A fun little effect of that is since they are no longer under Guilliman's direct supervision, they ended up developing their own cultures, which made them become something that wasn't just a differently colored Ultramarine, which was the fear that a lot of people had in regards to Primaris Marines in the lore. I think the Unnumbered Sons were very interesting, especially with how they interacted after the Crusade with the other chapters that they were going to be brought into. I bring it up a lot, but the Flesh Terrors are just the best and worst things ever for the setting. They hate the Blood Angels reinforcements they were given. They hate them so much. There is a good short story in the Successors anthology that I would recommend to anyone trying to learn more about their perspectives on matters and how they interact with the greater changes to the Imperium at large. Spoiler alert, it's not f***ing good. So far,
I think that the Grey Shields are probably one of the more interesting additions to the lore. It shows that brotherhood extends beyond just the blood shared by your gene sire. So seeing all of these Marines interact with each other in such a rowdy but friendly way, it just makes the setting more human. For 8-foot-tall demigods, sometimes there can be a bit of a missing key element, and that is that oh-so-crucial part known as humanity. I like them, and I understand why people don't like them. But if I could get on my soapbox real quickly and preach as to why it's kind of important for Space Marines to display an element of humanity, I know it's not much of a hot take to say I enjoy it when my stories can appeal to my sense of morality and humanity rather than just show cool shit that I have no personal emotions about, unless it's Baki. I really like Baki. When it comes to displaying human emotions in Space Marines, it gives me something to latch onto. The Black Templars are one of the most inhuman Space Marine legions, treating some humans as less than dirt to them, but seeing them more as a thing that needs to be served rather than just a person that they can empathize with. But when it comes to books like Hell's Reach, where you see Merrick Grimaldus, the main character, empathizing with a human and struggling to do so because it's not coded in the Astartes' way of thinking, it gives me an understanding of how they feel. I understand seeing someone go through a very tragic incident and not knowing what to say and simply avoiding it. And that's why I like the Unnumbered Suns. There are many moments in this where they don't understand the world around them, but they're constantly trying to. They're trying to adapt to a world that has gone crazy in the time since they were in cryosleep. Before I leave, I'll give you one good example of that from the book, rather than just, gushing about Hell's Reach for the 1000th time. Towards the end of the Indomitus Crusade, when Gilliman announced that he was going to be dispersing the Unnumbered Suns to various different chapters and sending some to reinforce currently existing chapters, the news came down and it was mixed in terms of responses. Some were going to the chapter that they wanted to. The Dark Angels representation in Dark Imperium was going to the Dark Angels. The Blood Angel was going to the Blood Angels. But they all had this pang of, I have fought with these individuals for about 100 years now. I'm going to have to abandon them and probably never see them again. So there's this constant minor pang of sadness, but acceptance that you're going into a new chapter in your life. And it comes to a head when someone who I've already talked about on this channel, Bjarni, is told that he is not going to where he wanted to. He's not going back to Fenris to see his homeworld. He's going to a new location and never seeing the Space Wolves again. Well, until the next book, but that's neither here nor there. Watch my Bjarni video, it's good. So there are these constant weird powder keg moments where they get what they want, they don't get what they want, and they're very relatable and very human, which, say what you want about Space Marines being inhuman monsters, I think it makes it a story worth reading about, and it makes it a faction worth learning about. As a part of the content I'm making for members only, I will say I'm going to be stretching this one out quite a lot, because the chapter I'm covering today does not have a lot of information on them, and what I could find isn't really that plentiful. So, using the topic of today's discussion, I'm going to more discuss an interesting topic around them rather than about them. So what do I mean? Well, if I were to give a cute little thesis statement, I think it would be, it's important for even gods to have a backup plan. So, speaking of being second best, let's talk about the chapter for today, and how they probably have nothing to do with the Emperor's children, but I can make a case for it. Also, I had to fill this slot anyhow, and since the Emperor's children haven't gotten an update as of me writing this, I, don't have many options. So, who are we discussing today? The Flawless Host
a warband of Chaos Space Marines dedicated to Slaanesh. They used to be called the Shining Blades, which is a topic I always found interesting, tracing the lineage of a Space Marine chapter all along its path to damnation. Who were the Shining Blades before they became the Flawless Host? We don't know much. I know there was a short story that I tried to find online, but had a weirdly tough time locating. And everything I could find out, they were a very, very, very proud chapter of Space Marines. Very likely from the stock of Guilliman. The reason why I say it was Guilliman is because descendant chapters of the Ultramarines are usually incredibly different from the actual Ultramarines. Imperial Fists are, for the most part, always stoic to some degree, and so are their descendants. The Blood Angels are vampires. It's kind of hard to not know what is a descendant chapter of the Blood Angels. And the Raven Guard always tried to be at least sneaky or spooky or both. But from the documented cases of them in the lore, you could make the case that they may have actually been from Loyalist Emperor's Children gene stock. Or at least when they were Loyalist. The reason being is linked with their stated demeanor and the reason they fell. They were listed as being hyper-arrogant, believing they were the best, the most flawless martial combatants in the universe. They fought and fought and fought, proving they were the best, and one day, some people on a planet they had conquered did not show them the reverence that they believed they deserved, which sounds almost identical to like 90% of Slaaneshi Emperor's children stories up to this point. Hell, Lucius the Eternal himself turned double traitor just because the side he was on wasn't saying he was the best of all of them. So, the Shining Blades, insulted by the indignance of someone saying, hey, you're not perfect, ended up murdering the entire planet in such a flawless display of indulgence that they kinda caught the eye of Slaanesh, which is weirdly hard to do for some reason. It's easy to kind of get the attention of some of the gods on a person-to-person basis, like the Black Legion. They have a bunch of individual worshipping characters. So you have a Khorne Berserker, is a guy who worships Khorne and gains favor from Khorne. You have a Tzeentch Sorcerer who worships Tzeentch and gets favor from Tzeentch. But for an entire warband to be seen and gain some degree of favor from an individual god is pretty rare from my readings. So they killed a planet, became a new group called the Flawless Host. They have a few quirks that make them a little bit more like the Emperor's children as well. Like, for one, the most known thing about them is the ludicrous amount of combat stims they use in order to be the best at combat in any situation. Be it siphoned Tyrannid adrenaline or stolen friend zone from an Eversor assassin, they will crank it all up to 11 and then go into combat. Probably a little twitchy. I mean, far be it from me to judge, but the last thing I want to do in a combat scenario is be lost in a fucking K-hole and know that within 20 minutes, if I don't finish up what I'm doing, I'm going to probably get lost in DT City. Ultra coke fiend behavior aside, they also have a weird propensity to, instead of raiding worlds and supply caches, they deadass just conquer them, tearing them to pieces and just putting them under their own rule by the end of it. Probably turning it into a massive fucking trap house to make the super coke they need to survive. It's kind of interesting. I think their armor paint scheme is very good as well. It's definitely a good Slaaneshi style paint scheme. The pink that has the corrupting dark purple coming up on its side, it's pretty cool. So this leads me to kind of discuss my point from earlier, but in my mind, there are 4 patron legions for the Chaos Gods. The Death Guard, the World Eaters, the Thousand Sons, and the Emperor's Children. Each of them exemplify the key features, or at least some of the key features of the Chaos God they worship. But what if I told you, in the lore, the Chaos Gods had backups for all of these? I'm not kidding. I did research, and this may be a bit of a cracked theory, and it's probably incorrect, but the Chaos Gods have a second favored chapter after each one of the original legions. For Nurgle, it's the Purge.
exemplifying the eradication of life through disease. For Khorne, it's the brazen beasts, becoming obsessed with making more and more demon engines to slaughter for the blood god. For Tzeentch, it's the scourged, plagued with visions they do not want, but use them to great advantage. And if you couldn't tell, I'm angling that the second favored chapter of Slaanesh is the Flawless Host. They have that air about them where Slaanesh is gassing them up but giving them room to breathe in order to see if they might be more worthy than the Emperor's children. I mean, the Third Legion still has fucking Fulgrim, that nasty-ass stinky bitch, but the Flawless Host has some of the weirdest drug binge murder fuckfests that have ever occurred in this setting under their belt, which, by Slaanesh's mere existence, is kind of insane to think about. I think it would make sense because of how the great game proceeds. Basically, all of the Chaos Gods go from place to place and play the same game, picking champions and trying to wipe out the other's forces, in order to obtain more power, of course. So logically, it would make sense to have an already gassed up second in command, ready to charge into Dr. Feelgood by the Motley Crew, playing as loud as possible from the biggest speakers imaginable. I think it's a cracked theory, like I said, that is probably incorrect. But it's one of my favorites. It all goes back to the old Einstein quote of God does not play dice. I mean, he was more referring to the lack of existence of God, but it does apply here to some degree with the gods stacking the deck in their favor as best they can. That's kind of just a theory. So the Flawless Host are a heavily martially inspired chapter with a focus on melee combat and being the best at everything. A surgical strike rather than a massive explosive. Their paint scheme is really cool. They're a Slaaneshi Legion that isn't the Emperor's Children, and a lot of people don't really like the Emperor's Children, so if you want to have a second choice, they are there. And I just think they're cool. There's a few third-party models that people show off online and a few kit bashes that people have been showing that I think are really interesting. That's just me. Do you want to play a chapter that does not have extreme mainstream appeal while still appealing to one of the 4 Chaos Gods? Do you want to be the best at playing sword fight? Do you want to take every drug known to man and then wake up an hour later still wanting more? Then maybe the Flawless Host is best for you. So in doing this, I kind of have to skirt the line from time to time on what is a successor chapter and what isn't. So the successors today are from the Ultramarines, but god damn do they have one hell of an aesthetic similarity to the Iron Warriors. It was actually a theory for a long time that they are actually successors to the Iron Warriors, but in this case, unfortunately, the mystery was ruined by James Workshop himself in the modern interpretations of the chapter. Is that going to stop me from placing them in this spot for the Iron Warrior successor as an excuse to cover multiple Ultramarine successors in one go? No. No, it will not. I quite fucking enjoy blueberries, and I will eat as many as I damn well please. So to start off, why the fuck do they look like the Iron Warriors? And to discuss my main theory on this, I'm going to give you a quick biology lesson. See, once upon a time, I was in fact involved in biology, specifically vertebrate paleontology. And one of my favorite topics in the entire field is a very simple concept known as convergent evolution. So, convergent evolution is essentially when two species that have nothing to do with each other and are in very different locations evolve very similar traits under the same stresses. A good example is the wing of a bird and the wing of a bat. Both skeletally have very few similarities, but both function very similarly. That's kind of how the Silver Skulls operate, where the Iron Warriors are called that simply because where Perturabo grew up, he cast his warriors in iron and encouraged them to adopt a very stoic internal process. The Silver Skulls were a chapter of Space Marines founded on a planet known for headhunting. So as a natural extension of that, they tended to keep the skulls of the most dangerous opponents they had faced as trophies. and the most dangerous of all, kept in their chapter monastery, were dipped in silver to preserve them for all time. Thus, the Silver Skulls. You can see how both come to the same conclusion and end up in the same spot, but fuck me, I will never be able to explain why that skull shape is the one they use to mark their chapter, as that shit looks straight up torn off a shoulder pad from an Iron Warrior. So with the mild bit of discourse out of the way, and a minor amount of educational material as well gone, let's talk shop here. Who are the Silver Skulls? A pretty fucking cool chapter, if I do say so myself. I think they are genuinely fun after doing extensive research into their lore. I find them to be quite unique. The thing that makes them unique is weird. So like most chapters, they do follow the Codex Astartes pretty to the letter, you know, Ultramarine successors and all that. And that's kind of the main thing they do like everyone else. Everything else they kind of do is very different. For one, they are incredibly superstitious to the point where it is noted several points in a lot of the resources where they are written about in. If they weren't as good at their job as they are, they would totally be tracked down by the Inquisition for a nice round of questioning. On top of that, their superstition has caused a new rank to be raised amongst them, called a prognosticator, which is not to be confused with the prognosticator of the Grey Knights, which basically serves the exact same purpose of the prognosticator for the Silver Skulls, but more functional and actually practical. Who are the prognosticators? Essentially, if you have any psychic aptitude of any kind, then you are inducted, or at least attempted to be inducted into their ranks. Their goal is to read the future and see if the upcoming battles are in their favor, see if the portents are good. The Silver Skulls are so superstitious that if the portents are not in their favor, they do not fight at all, which frustrates their allies to no end. Unless they actually see the portents in their favor, then they act with such brutal determination that it actually seems like they can will the destiny of the battle in their favor. Now, I'm making this seem more cool and interesting than it actually is, but time to deflate your image of them, because they use the Emperor's Tarot deck like a 16-year-old girl trying to discern if there are in fact ghosts in their parents' house. Yeah, they use a tarot deck and psychic fuckery to see if the battle is in their favor. This shit is bananas. I love them for it, though. They are a chapter of Space Marines with a long-ass reputation for being really good at their job, and comically enough, they are among the earliest designs of Space Marines to ever be released. So with that, take a look at this goofy art of them being old Space Marines. God, old Space Marine art just hit different. So another thing I want to bring up is a very common discussion point for Ultramarine successors. How is it that the culture and genetic expression of an Ultramarine successor can be changed so much from the original stock? It all comes down to the simple fact that Guilliman encouraged the successor chapters to take on the culture of the worlds they recruit from as well as the worlds that they initially came from. It's why the Mortifactors are without a doubt an Ultramarine successor. They just grew up on a world where cannibalism and bone wearing was very common and a good way to display social status. So Ultramarine successors do have a tendency to be very different from the parent chapter, or just like the same as an Ultramarine but spicier. To put it frankly, I like the diversity of cultures in them, but it's still weird that through all that encouragement, they ended up accidentally into Iron Warrior lookalikes. A few more interesting facts about the Silver Skulls before I go. For one, their chapter masters always have the same name, no matter how many hands it passes through, the name itself being Argentius, which must get pretty damn confusing after a little while, I'll say. They have a very feral style of combat. Instead of well thought out and defined lines of battle, they just tend to fight in smaller combat squads. I suppose it's more like the headhunting parties they would have had on their home planet. They are known for being almost savage on the battlefield, going as close as possible to their enemy to hopefully engage in glorious melee. But if they don't really care too much, because big guns are really cool too, but bad for claiming the skulls afterwards. Yes, they sound like they're going to fall to corn at some point, but no, they won't, because for some fucking reason, they have been around for centuries, and nothing bad has ever happened. So, do with that information what you will. And with all that in mind, the Silver Skulls are an ancient chapter of Space Marines with a dedicated micro fan base of people who adore the aesthetic of the Shining Silver Knights. I think they are cool, albeit a little plain for my tastes. Are they successors of the Iron Warriors? No. Are they even related a little bit? I don't think so, though I could be wrong. As part of me trying to make sure that people who pay for this content are happy, I am left with a very interesting set of choices to make. I have to balance the three options that most of these videos come with. I can make it unique, make it interesting, or just make it fun. If I were to make a White Scar Successors unique video, I would cover the Marauders, which I already did. And you all seem to like that. If I were to make it interesting, I could cover a chapter that has traits of both the White Scars and other Legion's traits, like the Black Guard, which are actually a Raven Guard successor. Or I could make it fun. So by process of elimination, I decided to go with something a bit fun. And that is the Stormlords. If you're paying attention to my main channel releases, I posted a video last week about the Skull Takers, and in that, their Chaos Lord actually came from the stock of the Stormlords, which are a White Scar successor chapter. So I decided it was cool to do research for both chapters at the same time. Kinda worked out nicely if I do say so myself, which I do. So, who are the Stormlords? Well, to put it bluntly, they are a successor chapter of the White Scars that also has kind of this Pokemon rival-esque view of their progenitor chapter, where they show up every now and then and try to do better than their parent chapter. And the White Scars usually respond understandably with, "Oh, fuck, not these guys again." Though, the competition is pretty fun, described as being a bit reckless in order to prove they are in fact better than their progenitor, which is really fucking funny to think about. They tend to do the same shock and awe-style drive-by tactics that the White Scars do, but with a bit more pizzazz and screaming and probably dying horribly. The Stormlords as a whole present a specific brand of chapter in this universe, the kind where they are always just kind of around and usually supporting another faction, and usually lend lore for other chapters to use, but they don't ever get the limelight that they usually deserve. I think every chapter in and of itself deserves some degree of a push to make them more present in the lore, because every single one of them has interesting stories to tell. You know the chapters that I'm talking about that don't get much attention. They are only there to play second fiddle to the original chapter they spawned from. The Angels of Absolution for the Dark Angels, the Genesis chapter for the Ultramarines. These chapters in and of themselves are very interesting, to say the least, but they do tend to only be included in stories about their progenitor chapter, and they don't seem to be that different from them, if I'm being completely honest. I think that the Stormlords are just different enough. Not so different like how the Iron Snakes are very different from the Ultramarines, but more so Black Dragons from the Salamanders. So to cover a few of their differences, the first thing most people notice about them is their color scheme is absolutely fucked. And something that a fellow content creator actually pointed out to me is that the Stormlords are actually not ever depicted correctly in art or in miniature form. So you see the half and half color scheme of red and white. It's very White Scarsy. But then you see the bright yellow helmet. It's pretty garish, yes. It's actually worse than you think, because the company of the Marines is denoted by the color of the helmet, unlike with, say, the Imperial Fists, who denote their company with the colored border around their shoulder pads. The fucking Stormlords go dick deep and just color their head neon colors to show what company they're in. First company are white helmets, second company yellow, third company red, and fourth company is apparently neon fucking green, which I feel more people should paint because it looks ugly. They paint laurels on the top of their heads if they are a veteran, and it kind of adds a bit more of a balance to the color scheme.
I love little details like that, by the way, that separate chapters in how they distinguish themselves. Like for the Black Templars is a good example. If they have a black trimmed shoulder pad with a white center, they are just a normal Marine. But if they are a chaplain, the shoulder pad is all black, black rim, black center, but with white iconography. If it's all black but with red trim and white iconography, they are a veteran or one of the Sword Brethren. It's pretty cute how chapters go about it. I like this method even though it's gonna look like shit on the tabletop. I think it's very cool and very interesting to do. They'll definitely stand out. Like having a bunch of random colors in a squad. Wherever I went, I couldn't find everything about the companies, basically the different colors, but it looks like they follow the same, if not similar structure to that of the White Scars, referring to different companies as brotherhoods, and each brotherhood having different names denoting their purpose. The last major thing that came from the Stormlords is kind of weird. Basically, in a skirmish they had with the World Eaters, which are big boy Marines, they ended up losing a few guys who were abducted, one of which was an unfortunately named man by the name of Sergeant Balzac. This man ended up being tortured, psycho-indoctrinated, and also just probably given the butcher's nails. And it ended up with him becoming a Khorne Berserker. But not only that, he would reap a bloody path of carnage and destruction so long that it ended up with him becoming the Chaos Lord of a pretty important warband of Khorne-worshipping Marines known as the Skull Takers. I covered them already, but I feel it is important to note, because I like that as an idea. And here's a little theory crafting for you. I honestly hope that there is some stories written about the Stormlords where they have to come to grips with the fact that someone a part of their chapter, or at least used to be a part of their chapter, is quite literally a massive threat to the Imperium now. Lord Zufor is his name now, and he is probably one of the most dangerous generals under Abaddon that there are. So having them have sort of a Dark Angel-style hatred and desire to murder him would be a bit of an interesting way of going about it. It might humanize them a little more. It's not the kind of story you see often. You see it sometimes with the Dark Angels, who find actually chaosified fallen angels, but not so much with other chapters. It's a neat gimmick that definitely deserves to be explored more. So in general, the Stormlords are a bit of a copy of their progenitor chapter, but with a few extra bits and bobs added to them. They are quite literally White Scars, but spicier. They have this obsession with trying to one-up the White Scars that keeps them from being a bit too samey, but I can see how they are a bit repetitive. Space Wolf time! It's Space Wolf time. It's time for me to talk about a Descendant chapter to the Space Wolves that I think is interesting and kind of fun, which you'd think would be hard considering my rather anti-Space Wolf style opinions. But nah, I already had this one lined up and hinted to the fact a little while ago. I said I'd cover them, so I'm here. So for a bit of context, the Space Wolves are a bit averse to the idea of having a successor chapter of any kind. They've had bad experiences with it in the past, as well as they've had quite a lack of interest in Gilliman's glorified paperweight known as the Codex Astartes, preferring to follow the Book of Russ, as it were. But they didn't really have much choice in the matter when Call made a bunch of new Marines, froze them for a couple thousand years, and then unleashed them all at once on the stars. So there is that. And from that, you get the chapter I want to discuss today, which is the Wolf Spear. I have briefly mentioned them in the past when I made a video about one of my favorite space wolves, Bjarni Arvidsson, but I feel like they are significant enough of a presence in the recent writings for me to actually do more work on them. So, who are they, what are they, etc., etc., etc. Pretty simple to start. Basically, they were created in the Ultima Founding, which is a founding of Space Marines to create a whole fuckload of new chapters out of exclusively the Primaris gene stock. So this is a 100% Primaris Marine chapter, meaning they do have access to some of the best gear in the setting, but the least actual practical experience in combat. It also means that they have the most dulled
dialed down gene-specific eccentricities. They are less feral than that of regular space wolves, which does play to their benefit, and their downfall in equal measure to some degree. It's one of the major sticking points for the early Primaris Marines, where they had the majority of their own gene seed flaws removed by Call, so you had stuff like Blood Angels with no Black Rage, you have Iron Hands that are a bit more likely to think emotions were kinda cool, and Space Wolves that actually knew how to follow the command chain without honor duels all the time, or them turning into feral berserking werewolves from time to time. It also removed a lot of the more unstable but beneficial aspects. See, the Black Rage may be a bit of a downside, and turning into a werewolf makes it a bit harder for you to control yourself, but you lose the increase in strength, the more efficient shock and awe tactics, and, the weirdly intense desire for alcohol so strong it could strip paint and kill lesser men. But the interesting fact is that the gene seed flaws eventually did start to manifest, making it difficult, but not impossible. I know the Flesh Terrors did start to warm up to the Primaris additions to their chapter when they started to fall to the Black Rage and manifest anger management issues. So, with the Wolf Spear, you have an entire chapter that is slowly coming into itself. See, prior to them being the Wolf Spear, the majority of them were simply Gilliman's unnumbered sons. Primaris Marines with generically colored armor indicative of their gene seed, so powder blue for Space Marines, red for Blood Angels, and so on and so forth, and they had a gray chevron on it to denote that they all worked together. This was during the Indomitus Crusade, and they made up the bulk of the forces that were used to assist in that crusade. And from there, once said crusade was over, they broke up and divided the Marines to either their own chapters or to reinforce currently existing chapters. There were so many fucking Marine chapters made up from the Ultima founding, so there is a bit here to discuss. But my focal point is the Wolf Spear. Now that you have the context of their creation, the Wolf Spear, their name, coming from one of Russ's weapons of legend, are a chapter with a specific purpose in mind. See, a lot of Space Marine chapters are made to cover specific issues and regions. You have the Iron Snakes cover the Reef Stars, you have the Emperor's Spears cover the entirety of Nematon and Alara's Veil, but the Wolf Spear were created to cover a weird minor warp rift that spews out demons exclusively at night, known as the Pit of Raucus. It was kind of an ancient hole in the universe that connected with the planes of chaos, and at night would spew forth random demons from anywhere in the warp. Now, due to it being a bit cut off, it wasn't that big of an issue, but was a bit annoying to have a spot where demons could just pop in whenever they chose to. It is a bit of a conundrum, and a lot of the Wolf Spear were a bit upset, feeling as if they were essentially just put in the middle of bumblefuck nowhere to take care of some random minor warp rift, instead of being at the head of some massive incursion force to go actually, fight the forces of chaos. But they have in history started to handle it in stride. They have kind of adopted this mentality I refer to as party all night, fish all day, where at night it's fucking go time, bros. The demons are here and it's time for the Wolf Spear to crack some skulls, which, outside of the losses they see, they do kind of enjoy it. Never-ending brute warfare is kind of the Space Wolves thing. And during the day, it's mostly just R&R time, with them relaxing, recovering their wounds, and deciding who gets to take the next shift fucking up the demon hole. It ain't much, but it's honest work. They have had some interesting adventures where Space Wolf emissaries showed up to judge their Space Wolfiness and see if they're worthy of being called a chapter of the Space Wolves. Initially, the Wolf Spear captains were like, fuck this, you don't gotta say shit, we got a job to do. To which the Wolf Priest in question pulled out a census and was like, aight, cool, I guess you're off to it then. To which a few Battle Brothers immediately moved to say their captain didn't know what the fuck he was talking about and wasn't even from Fenris, so pay him no mind, we trained him wrong as a joke. It was a cute story, and it ended with the Firstborn Marines fighting alongside the new Wolf Spear Primaris Marines during the Party All Night segment of their schedule, and honestly having a great time doing so. Though, it does bring to mind the fact that these Marines, after 100 years of doing this, are gonna be so fucking overleveled. They are consistently fighting nothing but the strongest enemies the Imperium can face and consistently winning every night. Give it some time, you're going to have super marines at some point. I want to see them do a buddy cop movie with the Exorcist and the Grey Knights. That'd be so fucking cool. With the Imperial Fists, you gotta admit, you aren't exactly starved for choice here when it comes to significant Space Marine chapters. So you can pick out some pretty banger choices and you got yourself an absolute slam dunk. You got the Black Templars, you have the Crimson Fists at the forefront, but behind the scenes you have equally interesting chapters like the Excoriators and the Celestial Lions. Going through each and every one of them, you do have a bit of breathing room to construct a decent narrative about what you would like to talk about. But I think, as per me being the embodiment of some young child jumping up and down and screaming, I'm special, I'm going to talk about the Soul Drinkers. No, not those ones. The new ones. What do I mean when I say the new ones? Well, the old Soul Drinkers chapter died the fuck out. Like, full on, they were mutated as shit and got ripped to pieces by an internal war and self-sacrifice. I want to cover them more in the future when I understand them more myself and go through the entirety of their series. I'm only partly through it now. But one thing that I do know a lot about is that during the Ultima founding, because the Soul Drinkers in the eyes of the Imperial Fists redeemed their honor, they were given an honorary successor to carry on their name and their colors as well as their lineage. Thus, the new Soul Drinkers were formed, which are 100% confirmed to be Imperial Fist gene stock, which you think wouldn't really be up in the air, but their gene seed lineage was up for debate towards their end, as they were so mutated that their gene seed was tested and did not come up as Imperial Fists. Or so you'd think it was because of the mutations. We'll come back to this later. It's a bit vague, but that's the thing. I am covering the chapter of Space Marines that was erected in their honor during the Ultima founding. Quick side note. What is the Ultima founding? It's when Big Daddy Call unfroze thousands of Space Marines that were newly minted Primaris gene stock to reinforce the old chapters as well as create new ones. There are set chapters made during the Ultima founding that are 100% Primaris Marine from these unfrozen lads, and the new Soul Drinkers chapter is one of them. Now, you'd think there wouldn't be too much to bring up about them, and you'd be half right. There are small tidbits of lore here and there, but they all kinda come up as a mixture of a continuation of the Soul Drinkers lore and setting the table for some kind of new travesty to begin. What do I mean by this? Well, in a lot of the new stories, there is this idea that the old Soul Drinkers were very much obsessed with the idea that they might in fact not be successors of the Imperial Fists. It's what they had raised their entire chapter upon. See, being a second founding Imperial Fist successor chapter comes with a bit of prestige. Like, with the Ultramarines, you can be a second founding successor chapter, but damn dude, there are a lot of them already, and not many of them are that interesting aside from like the Iron Snakes or some shit. But with the Imperial Fists, there are like 5 chapters, and each of them read like a Space Marine's greatest hit album. Crimson Fists, Black Templars, Excoriators, and the Fist Exemplar are all kinda well-known names, and for the Soul Drinkers to imply they are a part of these illustrious ranks would be kind of a big deal. Since it was never confirmed then, there has always been this long-lasting implication that they were just misled by some Tzeentchian trickery. Well, due to some interesting developments, we got a hint that they are definitely successors of the Imperial Fists from long, long ago, and also were one of the earliest. So how do we find this out? Basically, in the early days of the new Soul Drinkers, they were sent to bring a recently emerged Chaos Separatist faction to heal on a small planet in the middle of fucking nowhere, which they succeeded in. Now, this success served 2 major purposes. One, to quell the rebellion that was happening there. Basically, a rebel psyker was given power to influence the masses and wanted to stage a rebellion to murder fuck the universe as long as he could. It's somewhere between Slaneshi fuckery and Tzeentchian trickery, but the other half of this was that the Inquisition was testing the new Soul Drinkers to see if they were on the level and worthy of getting their sense of honor back. As the story goes, they squashed the rebellion because, I mean, at this point it's something Space Marines are pretty amazing at doing. There's an entire series about it. And from there you have them be given an ancient relic. It was a scrap of cloth
that was depicting an ancient ceremony of the Imperial Fist's successors, known simply as the Feast of Blades. The Feast of Blades is unironically one of the most badass traditions in the entirety of all Space Marines. Essentially, every single successor of the Imperial Fists is supposed to send in a champion to a set location. It's this massive combat tournament to see who is the best in melee, which I assume is the Black Templars, usually, but I digress. The winner gets a relic known as the Dorn's Blade to bring back to their chapter, and also a great deal of honor. So this scrap of cloth was depicting the Feast of Blades from thousands of years ago. There was the second founding chapters doing battle on it. There was also one Space Marine at the bottom corner without armor on, but on his chest was a tattoo. That tattoo had the old battle cry of the Soul Drinkers written in High Gothic on it. And before you ask, no, it's not a common phrase, so it was definitely a Space Marine from the Soul Drinkers. The phrase was, as I mentioned, in High Gothic, but it roughly translated to cold and fast. The implications here are twofold. One, the Soul Drinkers are in fact the second founding chapter that they originally thought they were of the Imperial Fists. And two, the rest of the cloth has been carefully cut away around that specific Marine to cut off what other Space Marines would be around them, but they neglected to remove that individual, likely because he wasn't wearing armor and they couldn't identify which chapter he was from. The only people in the 40k setting that would have the power to remove someone from history like that are the Inquisition, and the Space Marine who was given this as a token figured out as much. The theories here are fucking insane, because essentially you realize that maybe, just maybe, Tzeentch only played a part in the erasure of the history of the Soul Drinkers, the loss of their most precious artifacts, and the fact that their gene seed tests came up impure. What if it was all just a work by the Inquisition to delete this chapter from history? The implications of that could mean some more interesting things for the setting, because if they got caught doing it once and admitted that they did this because a Space Marine chapter did a good job once, then what other chapters are they hiding the history of? I don't think we will find out for a while, but I do think that the other thing that happened at the end of the campaign that they were waging is just as interesting. So one of the Space Marines who ended up dealing with the Mad Psyker who was manipulating the population found the journal of this Psyker. They located it on his body once they were tossing said bodies from the entire conflict into funeral pyres. He briefly contemplated throwing the journal into said fire alongside its deranged writer, but it turns out the old desire for knowledge that came with the original Soul Drinkers is still there, baby, because he ended up keeping the book, which has some equally grim implications as the banner fragment that was discovered. Does this mean they are once again doomed to fall to chaos? Maybe. Does this mean they are under the eyes of another chaos god? Probably. Does it have to be Tzeentch? In my head canon, no, because the entire planet was fucked by what felt like a Slanesh uprising, but Tzeentch operates in weird ways, so what the fuck do I know, right? All I know is, honestly, I love the Ultima Founding. The implications of old chapters that were lost being remade into something new, and the legacy that carries, and the new chapters having to uphold that honor, I find it amazing. The rebirth of the Soul Drinkers and the implications therein is just interesting, and that's all I have to say about it. Night Lords time, baby. My favorite legion, and the one that probably gets the least stuff. No, seriously, I mean it. There is less lore and less warbands to choose from for the Night Lords than I would wager any other Space Marines. See, with other warbands and other legions, you have the kind of soul successor type deal, where with Khorne legions, you could kind of say they're very similar to the World Eaters. With Nurgle legions, you could say they're all very similar to the Death Guard. But with Night Lords, they're kind of their own thing. So it's interesting to see what bands do show up from time to time and peel back the layers, as it were. That was a pun. But for part 8 of the paid content, I wanted to do something a bit different. Vary it up a little and do some cultural discussion as well as discuss one of my favorite concepts in the setting. So if you didn't notice, each legion technically has a representative unit in the game. It's a little more obscure with the loyalist side, but for the traitor side, it's pretty easy to determine. Iron Warriors have Havocs, World Eaters have Khorne Berserkers, Word Bearers have Possessed Marines, and for the Night Lords, there's nothing more representative than the Raptors. Raptors could easily be confused for their loyalist counterpart, the humble assault marine with a jump pack, and you'd be forgiving for assuming that, because externally you see the chainsword, the bolt pistol, the jump pack, and the screaming maniac, but here's the interesting bit. What if I told you there are entire societal cultures based around raptors and their ideals? The raptor cults, they are called. It's kinda cool, right? Okay, so let's take it back a bit and discuss the specifics here. So in the beginning, there were the Night Raptors. Night Raptors, as a unit in the armies of the Night Lords, they had a certain specialty. So the Night Lords as a whole specialized in terror tactics, scaring the living shit out of you until you couldn't fight back through slow, methodical raids and campaigns. So they would do that, and it would usually be pretty effective. Sneak in and kidnap a few thousand presidential candidates or their kids, flay them alive on television so people would know what you were capable of, and usually they're very much less liable to fight back. But what if you said, fuck it, we ball? What if you got rid of all subtlety and didn't just want regular fear and anxiety to be a permanent fixture, but you just wanted to scare the living shit out of every single ass you see? Well, then you have the Night Raptors. The best way to sum them up is the Night Raptors are not soldiers. They are murderers. They enjoy the hyper-fast, ultra-aggressive movements of the jump pack assault and prefer to run in with modified speaker grills to scream so loud that it bursts eardrums and sometimes even organs if you're close enough to one. Equipped with the loudest and angriest looking weapons you can find, the chain swords, chain blades, and the humble Nostraman chain glaive, they specifically target the weak and the stragglers of any group to take easy victories. They resemble what their name would suggest, a bird of prey, who prefers to attack individual small targets of prey rather than an entire group of armed men. So these individuals tended to be even more maniacal and a little bit more neurotic than the rest of the Night Lords, which is fucking saying something. They hold themselves in higher regards because of their specialization, so they are a bit odd about it. Well, mix in the warp, chaos, and a couple thousand years of service, and now you have entire cults propped up on these individuals who believe themselves to be something more than human, and sometimes even more than just simple Astartes. Mutations that are specific to them and their cults tend to propagate only with them. Claw-like talons for feet, bird-like beaks for their faces, their jump packs melting into their bodies and mutating for more power and more lift. Look no further for a greater example than the bleeding eyes from the Night Lords omnibus. Their leader, Lucoriphus, is a freak who can't even walk upright anymore and has to kind of hobble around on all fours. But upside, he's really good at what he does, even being able to 1v5 swooping hawks from the Eldar, which is difficult to accomplish, I've heard. That being said, he was a named Space Marine, so there is that. But I digress. So now that we know a little bit about the background of the Night Raptors and what they do, what exactly are the Raptor cults and what is their purpose? Well, the Raptor cults are, as their name implies, a group of Chaos Marines that are a smidge warp-touched and that use jump packs to attack with chainswords and whatnot. But it does go a bit deeper. Like, for one, on the wiki it states that it's never specified they worship any specific chaos god, so it suggests they worship some minor god, which, okay, I guess. I never got that impression from reading about them in stories. I feel a lot of people assume if you worship chaos, you have to pick a god or pick all of the gods. But I feel Raptor cults actually just worship the concept of chaos as a whole. So they basically just like the end result of anarchy, panic, and fear. So I guess the closest you could say is just a mixture of all of them. In essence, just a modified version of Chaos Undivided without actually worshiping the gods. I guess secular chaos worship, if you would. Though, that isn't to say there aren't god-sworn chaos raptors. In fact, there are probably a few, considering the high-risk lifestyle tends to lead to higher levels of glory and favor in the eyes of certain gods if you were to swear yourself to them. Or death, usually death. So, what is the purpose they serve? It's actually pretty easy to discern this, as their purpose kind of remains the same from the original Night Raptors. They all still enjoy murder quite a lot, though this time they enjoy eating the people they kill. So, Chaos Warbands usually employ Raptors to accomplish any feat that requires a high degree of mobility and terror tactics, shock and awe, screaming, and, jumping on top of very high walls, which the Raptors will tend to do so with fucking gusto, further being modified by whatever chaos entity they like to interact with. It's usually pretty fun and lucky if a Chaos Warband can get in touch with a Raptor cult. They tended to be equipped with anti-infantry weaponry, but don't get it twisted, that doesn't mean they won't whip out the Thingamajig 9000 to blast your ass to next reality, tank or not. They are screaming warbands of maniacs that will work for food, war, fame, acclaim, and maybe a combination of all of the above. I really like the idea that they were retroactively mutated above game into something weird and grotesque, as their origins, like the literal origins as a miniature, was that Chaos was supposed to have more or less the same shit that the Imperium was supposed to have, but with a few less pointy bits. So you give Assault Marines with jump packs to the Imperium, and you give Raptors to Chaos. It's pretty fun to track how they have changed, and the original Raptor sculpt is really cute because of the cute little wings on the side. And the one we now have does look a little bit clunky, but it's still really fun. It's a little clunky because it's in this interim state. It was released in 6th edition, which is kind of that spot where they were just about to update the Chaos Marine sculpts to kind of the true scale Marines that we have right now, that are all spiky, pointy, and pretty cool looking, but they still have the proportions of the Marines prior. So they have nice sculpts, but bad proportions. And I think it fits them for being light mutants who jump around on jump packs, so yeah. But you have those on the Chaos side, but looking over to the Imperial side, you have the new Assault Intercessors with jump packs, which I think look pretty cool if I'm being honest. It ends up with, as I mentioned, the old Raptors looking a little bit out of date, and a little old at this point, but not so much that it's impeding people from enjoying the sculpt like I do. I think they are a bit on the precipice where they should probably get an update in the next 5 years. Maybe with an update for the Night Lords as a whole, and giving us a Night Lords character fucking finally. God fucking damn it. Not everything has to be a black and gold armored Chaos Undivided faction, or a faction specifically sworn to one of the gods. But again, I digress. I think that's kind of the point though. They are kind of unique. Raptors and the Night Lords occupy a niche that no other faction kind of occupies. So with the Word Bearers, you have the Possessed. Possessed are basically just a better form of melee chosen. They have better melee weapons, and they're kind of like what you would get if you would mix Chaos Spawn with Chaos Space Marine chosen. Havocs, well, regular Legionaries can have a heavy weapons unit, so they can have that as well. And you can also have chainswords on normal guys, but with Raptors, they have the fear tactics, they have the high mobility, they have the low durability because they're just as durable as regular Marines, but because they're moving around quickly and getting in faster, they're probably going to get shot to shit. The loud Vox grills, as well as being able to carry specialist weapons. It's kind of its own thing, and that kind of is exemplified by the Night Lords themselves. The lightning streaked armor, the obsession with tactics that would not fit in with any other Legion. I think the Raptors are as perfect a fit as you can get for a Legion as possible to exemplify how different they are from other individuals. Part 9 means Blood Angels, and if you are familiar with me in my past work, I've always been a bit overly critical about the Blood Angels and what they do. More or less that we give the Space Wolves a lot of shit for being a bit repetitive with the phrase wolf, but we don't really complain too much about the fact that the Blood Angels use the word blood and all of its synonyms like 1,000 times in their codex for weapons, armor, and what have you. It's something I criticize them for quite a lot, but one thing people forget about me being me is I tend to change my opinion as I learn more and more about individual factions. I wasn't green going into this channel, but there is so many different books that present so many different options to interpret the characters of the setting that I genuinely think it's impossible to keep a steady opinion, as there are so many different perspectives to take. You know, is the Uriel Ventress that Guy Haley made in the Dark Imperium books the same one of the Uriel Ventress series or any other time that he's appeared in any other book? And today's topic is one of those perspectives, where you get a super interesting view on a faction that is the Blood Angels, so it makes me kind of endeared to them a bit more. So, who are we talking about? The Angels Vermilion. They are a second founding Space Marine chapter that is Codex compliant, and they have one of the more interesting histories in the entirety of the lineage of the Blood Angels, which is an interesting thing to say. The Blood Angels' successors are some of the more interesting chapters in the Imperium, and I can even admit that wholeheartedly. I like a lot of Blood Angel successors. The Flesh Terrors, the Blood Drinkers, the Lamenters, they all have a very interesting set of doctrine and rules that make them stand out from the original chapter a bit more than the original chapter stands out from the rest of the legions, in my opinion. Personality is key when it comes to being interesting, don't you know? Having a bad personality is better than having no personality at all. Like, case in point, when I think of a Space Marine chapter, and the only thing I can think of them is that they are really good at shooting, that's a bit bland. But say you have something like the Black Vipers, where every single time the Primogenitor chapter went to introduce them to the Promethean cult, the agents they send end up going missing, that's fucking weird, and that's fucking cool. So, with chapters like the Flesh Terrors, they may be horrible blood-drinking monsters, but they are fucking interesting because of their flaws, you dig? So, with that in mind, let's discuss the Angels Vermilion. The reason I bring all that up is because the Angels Vermilion are categorized by their deep-seated loathing of their gene lineage and even their mild contempt for Sanguinius as a whole. They see the curse of the Red Thirst and the Black Rage as the worst affliction they could have ever been bestowed. They don't see nobility in it. They just see it as a hindrance to their job, and actually blame Sanguinius for this curse happening to them. Though, alongside that, you have a very interesting fact, which is that they have one of the lowest rates of falling to the Black Rage out of every single Space Marine chapter in the entirety of the Blood Angels lineage. Not nearly as pristine as the Lamenters, but they are pretty damn close. See, they found out relatively early that drinking blood from time to time not only stems the flow of the thirst, but it also keeps them strong to some degree. They do detest this, and though this may not seem significant, trust me, it gets fucking worse. So, for one, they conduct a ritual. I believe every year or so, if I'm remembering correctly. This ritual has a rather dramatic name, which is the Sorrowing. Essentially, the Sorrowing makes them get a shitload of chapter serfs and menials and other slaves into a single room with a massive pool in the center. They are allegedly aware for the rite that is about to be done, I should note. Allegedly. They then flay every single one of these people alive, cast the meat and blood into the massive pool that I mentioned, which the chapter will then bathe in. But to make things weirder, every single one of the members of the chapter make small cuts on the veins and arteries of their body, on their arms and legs, so that they can bleed and add their blood into the pool as well. They also drain the blood of a sanguinary priest till he is almost dead, and then they just kinda steep in it until they feel a bit better. The remaining bloody slurry, once they leave, is then turned into kind of a combat nourishment hooked up to their power armor to be released during battle. And it's kept them from falling to the Black Rage, for the most part. So I guess it's a good thing, right? They treat the bones of those who sacrifice themselves for the chapter as the bones of martyrs, very important individuals to the chapter, are eternally respected for their sacrifice. The rite is done to prevent the eternal thirst from getting worse. They do still fall to the Black Rage from time to time when blood supplies run dry, but it is to a diminished capacity than normal. So the final thing to know about the Angels Vermilion is that they do not enjoy working with other Marine chapters. They prefer to keep to themselves, as it helps keep their secret shame aside, as the Sorrowing as a ritual is probably a little bit heretical, I will add. But that being said, it hasn't stopped them from being at least mildly chivalrous, and actually supporting other chapters of the Blood in order to survive some horrible calamity. They want to keep their secret as that, a secret. Because if they don't, there's a chance they will get excommunicated, which in the past has happened more often than you'd think for Blood Angels successors, or maybe you'd think it does happen a lot, as the Blood Angels tend to be a bit extra on most things involving warfare, so civilian casualties tend to happen. It is alluded to that Commander Dante is actually kind of aware of the sorrowing, or is at least aware that something is going on that probably shouldn't be with them. Now, who am I to say what Commander Dante should or should not be concerned with? Because as far as I know, I am not a space marine, nor am I a blood angel, and nor am I a man who has lived thousands of years and is hounded by a level of responsibility that I could never comprehend. But if I were to say maybe a chapter that was probably just maybe a little bit involved in some degree of heresy that you should probably investigate more than the Angels Vermilion, I would probably maybe just kind of sort of point out the blood drinkers and the fact that, for one, they're all hairless and look like Nosferatu with especially dry skin and bald scalps and giant teeth and pale skin, and their chapter master's name is fucking Orlok, but also they are the ones that have engaged in an incredibly actually heretical action in order to slow down the Black Rage, similar in concept to that of the Sorrowing, but the Rite of Holos is a bit worse. They ended up making a deal with, Kairos Fate Weaver, the fucking crater demon, that whenever they fall to the Black Rage, 1 in 10 guys sees Kairos instead of Horus, and he just offers them an easy way out of the Black Rage instead of falling to it, which they have all disagreed to at this point. It might not be like that forever. The Rite of Holos is a bit complicated, but methinks actually making a deal with the Bird Devil might be a bit more heretical than just a fucked up jacuzzi sesh with the boys, but that's just me, I suppose. Maybe I have something going on in my brain that Dante doesn't. Or maybe it's vice versa. We'll never know. But back on track, notable things to kind of key into for the Angels Vermilion is that they are especially weird in the fact that they are a second founding chapter, but have no reverence for their Primarch, which I find very uncommon for most second founding chapters. They tend to be pretty into the whole Primarch thing, they're descended from the original Legion and thus pretty close to the original heritage. Another funny side note is that for a faction that doesn't seem to like getting along with others, they do tend to partner up with the Blood Angels a whole lot. So when it comes to Iron Hand's successors, you tend to see a lot of the same shtick from time to time. Basically, it's all the flesh is weak, and then the Star Dragons did their thing, which is neat, I guess. But they tend to be based heavily around the original structure of the Iron Hands, especially with each major company of the Great Crusade era Iron Hands being based around the clans found on Ferrus Manus' homeworld of Medusa. So with that in mind, we are going to be covering a second founding Space Marine chapter that is actually descended from one of these clans rather than just being inspired by them, the Brazen Claws. I picked these because I find them incredibly interesting, and they are honestly one of the more important chapters of Space Marines as a whole to the setting, thus their inclusion in this series. Who are the Brazen Claws, and why are they so important? It's both easy and hard to describe, but let's talk about something a little more intangible to describe. Basically, the Brazen Claws are probably the most well-known Iron Hand successors of all of them. Now, they may not be the favorite of the entire fan base, but they are very much akin to like the Nova Marines of the Ultramarine side of things, where if you see the color scheme, you kind of see it and go, I know these guys. I call it the Howling Griffin effect, where you have in fact seen them before, you just never spoke to someone who used them. So what separates them from the Iron Hands in terms of just chapter aesthetic? Aside from the fact that they have a really fucking cool quartered blue and red color scheme, they do have a lot of interesting differences, but the main one can be summed up in a bit of a comedically reductionist sentence that is essentially, they are Black Templars if Iron Hands. Which is not 100% correct, but is kinda gonna capture the aesthetic of them pretty quickly. What do I mean by this? The Brazen Claws encapsulates that mentality of the flesh as weak quite intensely, to the point where instead of seeing the flesh as more of an apathetic downgrade and sort of anachronistic to the level of perfection they want to see, they actually see it as like a completely hateful and detestable thing. They actually fucking despise organic matter as a whole and think that machines are a lot more useful than meaty bits. This also translates over to them actually hating Space Marine physiology as well, even though it is incredibly enhanced, which is definitely an interesting thing, because it kind of highlights an underlying hypocrisy of the entire chapter, because if they just wanted to replace all of the meaty bits, then why become full Space Marines? Just put the few necessary endocrine organs in the brain, become Skitarii-style mechs, and then fight. It's been a while, but you could probably still make something like a Thalax. It would be fine. But I digress. They are a vengeful and angry chapter, one of the most bitterly angry in the entirety of the Space Marine chapters that exist in the setting, if I'm being honest. I'd even go as far to say they have a lot in common with the modern Iron Warriors, in how they go about war and go about all other aspects of life and living. They are brutal, violent, and try their hardest to simply be just living weapons, essentially, which is probably the best way to see them. But if you are going to see them, you probably will die for your weakness anyway. Because their hatred doesn't just extend to the meaty bits, it extends to the reasoning behind hating the meaty bits. They hate the concept of weakness as a whole. They respect strength, but not in a really outward kind of way. So, say your city got invaded by a chaos uprising, and you held out as long as you could. The Brazen Claws show up, win the fight, with maybe like 20 survivors left in the city, and then they execute you and the rest of the civilians because of your weakness and your inability to actually like survive a fight with chaos on your own. The main fun bit about these Marines is they actually lost their home world to an influx of chaos. This influx, in the long run, weirdly enough, probably did more harm to chaos than it would have if they just left the Brazen Claws alone. See, the chapter survived, and they wanted to make that chaos's problem for as long as they could possibly stand. And what happened after is they immediately beelined for the Eye of Terror in order to kill, maim, and burn every single fucking chaos worshipper and demon they see until the chapter either died or was sent back, or they just got bored. They even tried to help with the destruction of Cadia and fight off Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, but they weren't really close enough to engage in the main battlefront, so they ended up supporting some of the Cadian ancillary planets, which is nice. The whole being in the Eye of Terror thing ended up lasting for about 20 years of their time, which was fucking 20 years of non-stop war and demon murder, which might not seem like a lot in the grand scheme of the 40k setting, but you have to consider that the Horus Heresy itself took place in less than a decade, and much like the crusade that the Brazen Claws went on, it was non-stop fucking war the entire time. So when the Brazen Claws inevitably left the Eye of Terror, realizing they could kick more demon ass if they had more dudes, they found out that the 20 years they had experienced was actually 40 years in the Greater Imperium. See, being near the warp kinda does that to time for some reason. With that in mind, it was kind of a shock to them. Still around and still engaging in the long war of trying to murder fuck as many chaos worshipping pussies as possible, they are one of the most aggressive and, for lack of a better way to put it, explosive chapters of Iron Hand's successors. They do have a history of supporting other Marine chapters and being okay with them as a whole, which is reasonable because strong respects the strong and all that. That's kind of their whole mantra. One of the majorly interesting bits involving the Brazen Claws, and the last thing that I kind of want to touch upon, is that they actually had a small portion of their chapter fall to chaos, which was kind of a big deal considering their whole shtick for a few decades was that they absolutely hated fuck-ass chaos, so it was a bit of a smear on their honor. But they are coping with it well and avoiding censure pretty decently, all things considered. They have an aggressive style of combat, usually centered around the standard tactics of the Iron Hands, heavy equipment and whatnot, dreadnoughts, tanks, so on and so forth. But due to their increased level of absolute fuck you hatred, they tend to focus more on close range tactics, at least from where I was reading, though there is a bit of inconsistencies with some of their information. So the Brazen Claws are a successor chapter with an interesting yet difficult scheme to paint, and I think they are pretty cool for it. I think in terms of Iron Hand successors, having a bright, incredibly ostentatious color scheme that is immediately striking on the table is really interesting to kind of look at, and it also kind of aligns themselves well with using a bunch of more dangerous and brutalistic tactics like combat dreadnoughts instead of hellfire and range dreadnoughts. Another interesting point that I can't really fit anywhere else in the video: they paint their first company veterans with white helmets, which I think makes the whole paint scheme look a little silly, but oh, fuck it, look at that. That looks cool. What do you think? I think it looks cool. So the Brazen Claws are a classic chapter with an interesting yet difficult scheme to paint. Oh, hi, hello. Welcome to a brief intermission, I guess. I thought I'd kind of put this in between this slog, like a gas station and rest stop along a long-ass highway, and just check to see if you're all enjoying this. Isn't it wild how much I've changed over the course of just like what is ostensibly 6 months of video that you're watching? Yeah, shout out to Dutch, the gaming storyteller, for beating me over the head with a rolled-up newspaper until I was better at editing videos. Guy's a great dude. He's one of the reasons why most people in this community actually improve. Does a lot of editing for other big channels too, so go check his channel out. I'll shout him out constantly. If y'all got this far, cool. I'm glad you made it. This is a long video. But just to prove that you are, put your favorite Primarch in the comments down below and tell me why you like them, and I'll think you're a cool dude for doing so, because it means you dedicated yourself to actually watching this, which I genuinely appreciate. So with that being said, I just got a question for you. Wouldn't it be fucked if I waited this long to put an ad read in the video? Man. Anyway, did you guys know that I'm sponsored by GamerSupps? Whoa! No integrity, boys! Yeah, GamerSupps is likely gonna be a brand I promote on my channel pretty much indefinitely, or at least until they fire me. Gonna ride this shit into the sun. And I know you degenerates love the big titty anime waifu shtick, so you should support the channel and buy something. They got things like shaker cups, all the way to only marginally confusingly named drink products like anime girl thighs, which is... What flavor is this? Oh, it's orange creamsicle. Does it taste good? Oh shit, that's actually really good. By using code BONEZONE at checkout, you could get your own shaker cup or anime girl thighs flavored tub of GamerSupps now in both caffeinated or non-caffeinated versions for 10% off, and also support the channel. Thanks to GamerSupps for sponsoring this channel, and also thanks for worsening my grip on my own shaky moral grounds. Thank you for stomaching this ad, and back to the video. If you haven't picked up on it just yet, me covering the 11th and 2nd Legion spot is usually just a freebie for me. I get to fill in here whatever I want and justify it however I choose, because I mean, it's my channel. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a degree of thought that goes into these choices. See, I try to stick to some sort of theme, depending on what the series is about. See, for the 2nd Legion slot, I covered the Grey Shields, the unnumbered sons of Rabute Gilliman, which were essentially the first wave of Primaris Marines that came out of the frozen halls of Belisaria's Call, ready for combat during the Indomitus Crusade's outset. I have, since that video, learned quite a lot more about the Grey Shields, and to be honest, I probably think my old video is a bit out of date, but I'll cover it a little bit more in depth later. And I digress. Basically, because I covered the Grey Shields, it was only natural that I cover the Black Shields for the 11th Legion and throw you all for a loop. The Black Shields as a whole are a very interesting concept and have some long-lasting repercussions as to their reach in the 40k setting. They aren't really talked about that much, as their touch on the setting isn't as intense as any other faction, though I do find that they do serve a bit of a significant spot in the era of 40k. So what do I mean? It's pretty simple, actually. During the Horus Heresy, there is often reported to be two main factions, the Loyalists and the Traitors, excluding any Xenos factions. But technically, there was actually a bunch of smaller factions that popped up in between all of them. For the most part, donning black armor to hide their heraldry, and each of them having in common one single thing, and that being that they did not side with either the loyalist or the traitor sides of things. They sort of went their own unbiased way. These individuals, most times, were made up of loyalist members of traitor factions, whom actually assumed they were the last remnants of their parent legion's true and original cause, you dig? These were the Black Shields. The Black Shields were in as short an order as possible, essentially mercenaries who didn't choose a side, and by not choosing a side, they were free to do whatever they wanted in the short span of the Horus Heresy. There are numerous groups of them that could be discussed, and I'd not be doing them an ounce of justice if I didn't give them the time they needed, and I have yet to do as much research and read every single book that includes them, so I'll probably cover them all individually at some point. Hell, Indrid Har just got a model, and it is one of the best true-scale model characters they have released up to this point, with a fucking amazing dynamic pose and just very, very good sculpt work. He is in fact a world eater without the butcher's nails, which is pretty neat, but again, I digress. What else is there to know about the Black Shields? Well, aside from that they were a separatist, non-included faction of Space Marines during the Heresy, they tended to avoid outright conflicts with either side if they couldn't help it, which is usually how they would go about it. And alongside that, they tended to wear weirdly fucked up power armor. Due to them being separated from the majority of the manufactorums of either side, they weren't able to get replacements as they saw fit. So a lot of their suits of power armor were jury-rigged to have the performance of them maximized while also maintaining them as best they can with what little equipment they could. A lot of them are patchwork from stolen bodies that they killed on the battlefield when fighting either traitor or loyalists. The specific designation for this mark of power armor that is just the conglomerate is actually pariah pattern. So they have pariah pattern power armor, but their weapons are also called pariah weapons because they also had to have just piecemeal patchwork adjustments done as they were engaging in warfare. It is interesting, but it is a practice that probably fell out of favor pretty damn quickly because power armor for Space Marines is supposed to be balanced on a knife's edge, where if you do not keep it in check the proper way, it will burn out and break pretty easily. Maintenance as opposed to customization is usually more important. Although they were a part of the Horus Heresy, there is a bit of a reason as to why they aren't mentioned too much. They didn't play a huge part in the Heresy, to my knowledge. Their whole shtick was essentially recruiting new Marines that were rushed into the process of being a Space Marine so vast that the indoctrination to make them didn't stick as well as it could. Essentially making a bunch of Space Marines fight for a cause that they didn't really believe in or understand all that well. So many of them ended up defecting to the side of the Black Shields or just outright defecting to the opposite side of the conflict. Now, most of the Black Shields ended up getting disbanded, hunted down, or died out, but a few of them ended up actually existing into the modern era, allegedly. And I kind of want to bring up one of them in passing to discuss the point that I want to kind of make here, because there is one that is still around. So there was an entire Black Shield chapter of Space Marines that were made up entirely of an abandoned company of Emperor's children. They identified by the name of their company, which was the Death Eagles. They kept a sort of gold and pink color scheme similar to their parent legion, while also adding new elements to distinguish themselves, and named themselves as a chapter rather than a member of the Emperor's Children. These were the Death Eagles, as I said. Now, the original printing of these models and rules in the 90s confirmed that they were in fact loyalist members of the Emperor's Children, but it is said that the Black Shield group that went by the name the Death Eagles went missing after fighting a chaos-corrupted group of the Emperor's Children on some planet far away, and a new chapter arose swiftly afterwards called the Death Eagles. These Death Eagles had completely different power armor colorations as well as completely different tactics, and allegedly they were the successor chapter of the Raven Guard, which, yeah, makes sense, but I'd still like to think there's an idea there that they were possibly just the camouflaged and disguised version of the Emperor's children, because shit like that does happen. Allegedly, the original Minotaur's chapter, this fucking mustard and ketchup looking abomination, ended up getting killed off or going into hiding, then got indoctrinated by the High Lords of Terra to become their hit squad, becoming the Minotaurs. Again, that's allegedly, and there's a lot of other theories as to how that works, but you know how it is. So the Raven Guard successor has very different armor, but they go by the same name, so we don't fully know. But I do have my theories, who or what the difference between these two are, but it's probably something convoluted that could be hella explained in an ADB book. So the Death Eagle still exists today with this paint scheme, though I will say the older one is tits awesome. We need more pink Space Marines, dog. I swear. Regardless, there isn't much left in the way of the Black Shields now, but the name still actually exists in a not so prevalent way, but it still exists. In the Death Watch, if you are a member who forsakes the original chapter that you hail from and decide to become a permanent member of the Death Watch, you have to destroy/deface the old chapter iconography that you carry, as well as your honors, your ranks, your so on and so forth, and essentially live in shame, because though it is an option to give up your old chapter and come over here and live as a Death Watch, it is not seen as a good thing. It is actually seen as a great dishonor and shame. The Black Shields of the Death Watch are a very odd group of individuals, being often very sullen and not exactly happy to be around, because alongside forsaking their chapter, and thus if they run into another member of the chapter who's taken up Death Watch service who didn't become a Black Shield, it could get a little bit awkward. They also have to give up the ability to receive any honors, rewards, medals, or ranks of any kind, and only serve at the level of veteran of the Watch for as long as they exist in the Watch. So this is basically all the info we know about the Black Shields summed up in one video. It was a bit bare bones, but I plan to break down these topics a bit more later in a bit more of a public release, but you do get some interesting lore for now as a bit of a starter kit to understand what the fuck a Black Shield is. The Traitor Legions are always the weirder ones to cover in this series, you know? There is a degree of difficulty, as the most important part of them as a legion is the warband that contains the Primarch and the singular named Herald character. So, with the Thousand Sons, the most important warband of the Thousand Sons is basically just the Thousand Sons. It's the warband you think of. Same with like the Death Guard, the Emperor's Children, so on and so forth. So you can divide it up afterwards once you've covered them into similar warbands like I tend to do. But I think the best thing for me to do is to cover something a bit more complicated, but also a little bit more simple. I'm covering why the World Eaters matter as they do now, because it is important to understand why they are interesting and their impact on the world around them. I guess let's ask the basic question now. Why is it that the World Eaters are so important? Well, the answer I have for this question is pretty convoluted, but to cut to the chase, it's because they occupy a space narratively where you can do a lot with them, and it's all relevant no matter what it is. But also, it makes sense no matter what it is. So the rest of the video is just going to expand upon that idea and make a few silly jokes along the way. Okay? Cool. So the World Eaters are a legion that most people tend to actually have an opinion of. And what could this opinion be? The answer is as varied as the stars in the sky. Because, to be completely honest with you, the answer 100% depends on the person. As when you have a group of characters whose entire shtick is basically being affixed with a device that gives them angry dementia, you're gonna have people who like it and hate it. On one hand, you have people who love it because they like the grimdark aspect of the setting and hate all this talky-talky bullshit, so why should they care about if a Marine basically becomes a barking dog with a chain axe, right? But then you have people who don't like them for the exact same reason, that as characters in the modern day, they tend to lack a degree of, well, character. Aside from Karn, there aren't really any notable characters that stick out in my mind during the modern day of 40k. Sure, we can go back to the Horus Heresy and Great Crusade, and you have some neato World Eaters characters, like the Riven Hound and so on, but that's pretty early on in the Butcher's Nails doing they thing and progressively smoothing out the person's brain until they're as shiny and flawless as a Riverstone. So they do have a bit more personality. Currently with the Karn corruption thing, they tend to be a bit less thinky, so they are more or less frothing berserkers across the board, which can be a bit samey if you catch my drift. I know the ones that lose themselves completely either become an 8-bound or are chained up and turn into walking abominable Terminator type deals. So alongside those two individuals, you have the scholarly groups of individuals who find a degree of enjoyment in their struggles from the Horus Heresy and before that. Like, there's a lot of people who genuinely just enjoy the idea that the World Eaters were secretly kind souls due to their original gene seed and pre-being corrupted by the Butcher's Nails, but they were forced to be as angry as humanly possible, thus this kind of Greek tragedy angle to it, you know? That's kind of the category I tend to fall into, where I don't think the World Eaters are all that interesting, but they are fun in that weird sense, you know? Where you can talk about it to a friend at a local game store who's playing Cornate Berserkers and tell them, no, they are actually really sad when you think about it. God, I love Warhammer. So, when you look from a top-down perspective on them, outside of these angles, you see a few common things pop up, and one of the major things to note about the World Eaters is that they pop up a lot. Which is weird, but it makes a lot of sense, because they range the gamut between incredible big, massive, world-ending, system-destroying threats to minor incursion. They occupy the top and bottom niches of content really easily. And why is that? Well, for one, people like them, as I mentioned before. There's a lot to like about them, but alongside that, there is this concept that is a little hard to convey. So, with Chaos, you kinda gotta be careful, because each Chaos God has been gassed up to hell and back, so much so that basically their legions are walking apocalypses. So, if the Death Guard come to a sector, they're just gonna take it, unless there is a major incursion of Space Marines in that area to fight back, because the Death Guard don't just destroy a faction, they pollute the area and make it uninhabitable for anybody who isn't a Nurgle-like cultist or demons. With Tzeentch, say the Thousand Suns show up, they kind of have a similar presence where they not only warp an area into nothing like it was prior, they mutate everything and make it pretty much unlivable for a long period of time without having to glass the entire planet because of magic radiation. The Emperor's Children are not exactly on that level, but once they get done with an area, do you honestly want that shit back? The cleanup alone would give nightmares forever. Even on the level of something generic like the Black Legion, sure, you can make them a generic threat, but major incursions are kind of the main ideal, as they tend towards being the central antagonists of the 40k setting, so whenever the Black Legion shows up, it's usually in force. But with the World Eaters, up until recently, they didn't really have a way to permanently destroy worlds in a way where they couldn't be brought back. I mean, outside making them into a Cornate demon shithole, which does happen, but that happens with every single faction, so they're not really special in that way. There is also the Angron Rage virus that happened, which actually corrupted some Primaris Marines, that if basically you're within a certain range of Angron or his warband, you just start going to full-on chimp out mode and start throwing your shit at things. But whatever. What do the World Eaters do? Like, what is their shtick that makes them dangerous? They literally just fight good. Not even range tactics. Though, they do enjoy the good up-close pistol-up-your-nose type jobby, but they prefer to get in your face with a chain weapon and just have a good time. I like to think that Andrew WK is playing in their head while they're doing it, too. Just having the best time of their life, which is honestly just a good threat to anyone, as that's always something that is going to be difficult to deal with, but not impossible. See, the Death Guard, if they made a new disease you were unaware of, you kind of just lose, because you can't really treat it. With Tzeentch, well, good luck being a pile of wiggling meat because you got blasted by someone screaming penis blast. With the Emperor's Children, yeah, let's move on. With the World Eaters, if you go against them, you just have to beat them in unarmed combat, which is difficult, incredibly difficult, and sometimes impossible if you're dealing with Karn, but it's not impossible. If you're just good enough as a swordsman, you could beat them in a fight. I mean, hell, if you're good enough as a marksman and their brain is smooth enough, which in the 40k setting it usually is, you can just pick them off at a range, which won't work forever, but it will work up until a point, because Khorne represents this idea that he does not care from where the blood flows, only that it does. So you win, the Khornate Berserkers win, it doesn't matter, as long as someone wins in the end, or the fight lasts for a long time and is pretty damn cool, that's all he cares about. So that's kind of the appeal. They are everywhere, they have big personalities, and they are just really fun. But everything they do is going to be valid no matter what it is, you dig? It's kind of the opposite view of the Word Bearers, where they are both stereotypes, but due to the fact that the Word Bearers are underhanded and the World Eaters are overhanded, with an axe strike, they tend to get a lot more appreciation. Like, look at if you had 100,000 Khornate Berserkers, doesn't matter what they're going up against, that's still going to be a massive threat on a scale that is going to be very difficult to deal with. I just think that's really cool. They kind of get a lot of love for that idea that they're basically a club that wants to do what a club does. It doesn't need to think outside the box, and if a Khornate Berserker shows up, usually you can kind of figure out what they're doing within about 20 minutes, because they're not that smart. Again, Riverstone brains is flawless as a pearl. But it might just be me oversimplifying this matter. They are significant in the 40k setting, and important to the 40k setting because they occupy that filler space. And you want to know how I know that they occupy that filler space and are always valid? They show up in the Leagues of Votan's goddamn lore. They're that everywhere. There's a battle called the Battle of Orgvair, where they teamed up with a Nurgle warband known as the Purge and ended up fighting a section of kin-controlled space. And they actually played a significant role in the backstory of Uther the Destined, which I think is really cool. Part 13 is one of those parts where if you watch my main channel, I, at the time of this upload, released a video about things that people probably didn't know about the Warhammer fandom, community, and just Games Workshop as a whole, and its setting. And one of the things I mentioned was that the Mentor Legion is canonically from the gene seed of Rabute Gilliman, which is neat, in my opinion, because they are one of the most significant chapters of Space Marines out there. So that being said, it was kind of an obvious inclusion for this specific spot, don't you think? So the Mentors, or as they were called in the olden days of Warhammer, the Mentor Legion, are an odd chapter, where they were included in the older editions of Warhammer, evident by the name including Legion at one point, before they had kind of hammered out all the lore and what they can't call something and what they can call something. But in the context of the universe itself, they are actually kind of a new chapter, as new as things can be in this setting. They were made in the 26th founding of Space Marines, which, if you didn't know, we only have like 27 or 28 of them. So it is kind of funny that they are such an old chapter in terms of like the game, but in terms of the lore, they're relatively recent. It is a bit of an odd piece of information where the 40k setting hasn't been advanced up until really recently. It's been in a place of stasis until about 8th edition maybe, where the Primarchs came back, or were starting to come back. And prior to that, everything was just kind of a random war that was happening concurrently with the rest of the setting. The Mentors are a chapter with a storied history, even though they are such a young group of whippersnappers in regards to their lore. They are a chapter that stuck out as one of the most competent, one of the most intelligent, and one of the most efficient chapters in the entirety of all Space Marine chapters, let alone the ranks of Gilliman. So what separates them, and
what is there to know about them? So let's cover their obscured origins and move on from there. Starting off, because of them, I learned that chapters have numbers, which is weird. Every chapter that is created is supposed to have a number because it falls in line with the rules that Gilliman has put into place, which basically means you can only have 1,000 chapters and so on. So to keep track of it, every new chapter that's created gets a number, apparently. I have not seen any other chapters aside from the 20 legions that have existed with numbers, and also this one. So, new information to me, I guess, but I don't doubt you could probably find more mentions of chapters with numbers. But this is significant because the Mentor's chapter number is 888, which you'd think isn't important to know, but it does play into their history, as they are a chapter created to fill that spot after the prior chapter, the Star Scorpions, fell to chaos due to mutations in their gene seed and them being caught in the warp for just a smidge too long. So, with the Star Scorpions becoming a warband of the Dark Powers, the number 888 was open. And so those crazy kids who make new chapters for new purposes decided it was in fact time to fill that slot with a chapter that has fresh gene seed from the Vaults of Terra. That chapter took on the same colors as the Star Scorpions, though with different icons, and so they came to be. Now, we don't know much else about them, as they are an incredibly secretive chapter, but they are also incredibly well used. They don't trust other Space Marine chapters, as they have a very if I want something done, I'll do it myself mentality, which basically leads to their entire chapter being a bunch of elite trained veterans that would have a relatively higher level of proficiency in warfare than other chapters at base. They use this in maximum efficiency by deploying small numbers of Space Marines with Helots, which are basically just slave plus by their side. They also, due to their constant assistance from other aspects of the Imperium, have a higher level of technology. The fighting style of the Mentors is decided specifically based on efficiency. What is the best way to accomplish the mission at base, and how can it be accomplished? Like, one of my favorite examples is one Mentor Legion was described as a one-man army because he had 3 Helots piloting servo skulls linked with digital weapons that would fire small rounds that would just float around, but they would also feed information into an earpiece that he had into his ear as they were seeing things from those servo skulls throughout the battlefield. So while he was shooting his bolt gun and swinging his sword, the Helots would be sending him data from the skulls while also doubling his support weapons to fire in his blind spots to help him keep on going. That is some John Wick shit right there. But this plays into one of my favorite aspects of the Mentors, where essentially they have what I think is considered either a modification or a gene seed mutation, where every member of their chapter has a genius level ability to focus and take in information. Basically, they can lock in at a moment's notice. They are able to read situations at a superhuman level, even compared to the likes of other Space Marines. And because of that, it's where they get their name from. They send out squads to actually lead and reinforce other members of either Space Marine chapters or Imperial Guard regiments, leading by example. They tend to be pretty brutal killers, but in such a clinical and efficient way that it almost comes off as cold and detached. Don't get me wrong, I love the aesthetic of Marines who take pride in their defense of mankind. They are emotional and serious about everything, but I think there is a certain level of coolness that comes from Marines who kind of work like Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, where they don't seem to be particularly enjoying themselves. They seem more like they're operating out of some kind of obligation, but from this comes a level of determination to see a job well done, that they will kill every last person they can until it is done and not think about any kill afterwards. It's like Doom Guy on Xanax, if you catch my drift. He's chill, but don't fuck with him, you know? The Mentors are a storied chapter with a hidden history and are known for being so brutally efficient in the work that it's chilling to other chapters to witness them do their thing. And alongside that, they are known for not getting along with other chapters, as they see them as less efficient than them, which basically means they don't like any other chapter, and it's just degrees of annoyance at this point, you know?
So do with that what you will. This is one of those chapters I feel would benefit from thinking outside of the box if you were to try and run them on the tabletop. So, like I recommended with the Iron Snakes, I'd say if you wanted to run them true to the lore, run them with Death Watch rules. Give individual kill teams the deck kits that you want, make sure that they have the higher tech weapons and so on and so forth, and then field them that way without needing to get the shoulder pads and whatnot. I think having those kinds of workarounds allows you to play the factions however you'd want, which is always fun. So lore aside, and tabletop ideas as well aside, I just wanted to say I have a particular fondness for the mentors. I think they are really fun, and I think I like chapters that have a set of weird dogmatic practices more so than I like other chapters that tend to fall in line with what we think is Warhammer 40k. Like the Black Templars are the Warhammer 40k. They are everything most people like about Space Marines turned up to 11, which is cool as shit, but the mentors are literally a chapter full of nerds who do nothing but read and train all day. More than any other Space Marine ever could, I should note, and because of that, they are beyond efficient at what they do. There are accounts that for most Space Marines, their days are incredibly regimented and thought out almost to a T, and they have to work within the set guidelines that they have, but they always have leisure time and free time and time to relax. But with the mentors, it's shown to go so far beyond what is normally expected of a Space Marine, where everything down to the second is planned out, and they will not break the routine unless 100% necessary. I don't even think they get leisure time for the most part. I know there is one account in the Spears of the Emperor book where the mentor's brother in question that was in said novel enjoys like an additional 15 minutes of sleep every night. So he trains harder than he is normally supposed to do, which is insane, just to make up for that 15 minutes. I think the mentors are super fun and deserve a new book from time to time. When it comes to the Death Guard, there is a lot of significant reach they have in regards to the setting as a whole, especially in the modern day, as they were kind of the main antagonists of 8th edition, and with Zone Charadon being a thing, they were pretty central to that conflict as well. So, with all that in mind, who do we cover, and why are they important as a successor? Well, it's kind of easy, especially for me, because there is many different divisions of the Death Guard that make it easy for you to understand the differences between them. These divisions, or at least the larger versions of them, are the 7 Plague Vectorum. Vectorum are the Legion's equivalent to, say, Company Plus. Each company is divided from these Vectorum, and each Plague company makes up their own kind of minor hierarchy. There's actually like an entire graph in each Death Guard book to describe how it works, but the best way to understand it is there are 7 Plague Vectorum that specialize in a very specific disease, and each of these 7 Plague Vectorum splinters out into smaller company-style warbands. It's pretty easy to understand if you don't really think about it too much. Each one of these Plague Vectorum has a leader kind of individual who takes care of basically every major need in terms of governing the rules and laws of each Vectorum. And each splinter of the Vectorum has a Chaos Lord or a minor Demon Prince or maybe even a Sorcerer sometimes in order to govern that smaller body. So to say the people at the top of these Plague Vectorum are powerful is a bit of an understatement. I don't know if we know all of them. We know one has a Demon Prince, one is Mortarion, and one is Typhus, and each one has their own Plague Vectorum to lead. But as for the smaller, minor Death Guard war groups, you have stuff like the Tainted, which are led by Necrosius the Undying, who is a very interesting individual, but we're not covering the Tainted today. We're not covering even the Anvils of Mortarion or any of the more special versions of the Plague Vectorum. The one we are covering today is called the Palet Hand, and I think they are one of the more interesting warbands of the Death Guard. They have an outstanding bone cream with rust streaks paint scheme, and the lore we do know about them is pretty interesting. So, who are they? Well, they are one of the Plague Vectorum, as I mentioned, and they are a specialized group of Death Guard who have some pretty potent tactics. See, where other Death Guard are kinda like, whoa, shit be upon you, and then huck a rancid bag filled with dookie the same consistency of Wendy's chili mixed with a thick coat of melted Velveeta cheese, that upon striking you, splats open and you melt into a pile of sludge so rank that even the most oak of individual will tear up. The Palet Hand tends to, what the fuck did I actually even just say? Okay, sometimes my mouth goes faster than my mind does, so I'll occasionally say something and it takes a second to catch up, but man, why do I say these things? Jesus, that thing hit me like a shit-smeared boomerang. But yeah. The Palet Hand are heavy artillery-obsessed maniacs who do their best to blast you to pieces from a distance with mortar shells, tank shots, and various different ranged weapons that fire rounds that are equipped with their very specific disease. They have a ludicrous amount of predator tanks and land raiders, as well as those weird funky demon engines that Mortarion made because he was jealous of other things that were the same that the Imperium had. The fun thing is, they actually will only slowly approach you, slower than regular Death Guard, as they want their specific disease to take hold. See, they aren't like other Death Guard, where, as I mentioned, shit splat and melt you is the normal MO, but with the Palet Hand, they have a bit of a fun disease known as the ferric blight, which, if you know a little bit of Latin, is a disease that is partially fueled by the warp, and it causes the rapid decay of metals that it comes into contact with, as well as things like ceramite, which aren't technically a metal, but I digress. They will eat their way through your arms and armor until you're basically just a mostly naked man with a useless gun, but don't think that doesn't mean you aren't going to get sick if you're not made of metal. Remember, they are the Death Guard. They aren't just coated in a thick miasma of one disease. They have so many diseases, boy, you have no idea how many diseases they have. So, once your metallic life-preserving suit is destroyed, you're now exposed to them. Because of this specific disease, they have a fun track record of actually messing with factions that normally are a bit untouchable. Like, for one, they went to war with the Titan Legio, which is usually a good way to get shit stomped into oblivion, but, well, okay, they did lose the battle against the Titan Legio, but because of the ferric blight infecting several of the Titans, they actually ended up falling to chaos and created a Nurgle-based Titan Legion war group by the name of the Rust Hounds, which is a name that, in fact, goes hard. Another side fact of the Palet Hand is that they went up against the only faction that usually never has any real direct counters. It's usually just attrition warfare that beats them down. But this time, they oddly got hard countered by this faction. The Necron. Yeah, when your entire gimmick is destroying nothing but metal and whatnot, and you're going against an entire faction of metal dudes who can't be destroyed because they're made out of a living metal, you're kinda hard countering them. So they actually infected a few Novak Dynasty guys who ended up taking the disease back to their specific tomb world, and it's stated that they actually caused an epidemic because of this, which is really fun because, man, the Necron need more L's. No, I will not elaborate as to why. So why is it that I'm discussing these guys when I could be discussing others? Like, what makes them so significant that I had to discuss them before, like, as I mentioned, the Anvils of Mortarion, the Tainted, the Shitterlings. And that's because this was actually the first paint scheme I did when I started painting miniatures years ago. See, when I first broke into the hobby, I started with the first faction I played, which was at a convention demo, and it was Tau. And I was a big-ass fan of that faction at the time, which I learned really quickly. I did not like their playstyle. I like getting into melee, and I like being kind of crafty with a bunch of weird gimmicks instead of just standing and shooting. So, when 8th edition happened, I ended up being like, yeah, I'll grab the Dark Imperium box and split it with my at-the-time girlfriend. See, she was playing Space Wolves and I wanted to mix things up a bit. So I got them thinking Death Guard would be my secondary option. Cut to me suddenly having like 10,000 points worth of Death Guard and sold all of my Tau models to another friend. I even have some third-party models to represent different things to fit my homebrew Death Guard faction. But the thing that got me the most was the original painting tutorial for the Palet Hand that Duncan of the Two Thin Coats himself did. It stood out to me as some masterclass shit that carries a certain philosophy that teaches you a basic idea that is so interesting to think about if you think about it too much that I still use it to this day. It's such a good tutorial on how to make colors pop. Like, standard practice would dictate that, hey,
I'm painting a blue miniature. The miniature is kind of a mid-tone blue, so I need to shade in the recesses of the miniature a dark blue or a black so that it looks like it's shaded. So you shade with a color that's similar to the color that you're painting with, because if you shade with like a green, it doesn't look right. If you shade with a red, it looks kind of weird. But with the Palet Hand tutorial, it taught me something very specific, that if you shade something that is especially light, like in this case, it was a coat of Screaming Skull, which is a very light bone color with a very dark sepia, it adds a completely different character to the miniature. And I adore the fact that it completely changed how I could view painting miniatures. And it's such a cheap and easy way to be able to just make a miniature pop. I still use this philosophy to this day, as my hands are super shaky, but I've learned how to cheat and make my miniature painting skills look way better than they have any right to. I still use this technique to this day, but in the reverse. My current homebrew Death Guard are blue trim using Cantor blue, which is a very dark blue, and main color is this kind of cream beige bone color with Rakarth flesh shaded with Agrax Earthshade, but every single pit and pockmark I color with Wraithbone and then fill it in once it's dried with a thick coat of Iyanden Yellow, which is the contrast paint. It makes them look like they're glowing. Yeah, I have a terrible old ass phone. I don't have the ability to take good photos, but like this is the kind of idea that I want to show. So I love painting this. It takes a long ass time to hit every crack, but I really like painting these specific miniatures. And that was one of the reasons why I fell in love with the faction. And that's the reason why I fell in love with 40k more than I did even with the Tau. It made me realize that the game wasn't just a game, it was a hobby. And me being invested in the hobby is what led me to here. So, in my opinion, the Death Guard, and specifically the Palet Hand, are the most significant faction in the game in relevance to me. Because without this game, I wouldn't be here. Without playing the Palet Hand and loving the paint scheme, I would have gone probably a completely different direction. And I think that's pretty neat. So I'm allowed to put a little bit of bias on them. I have a lot of criticisms for the Death Guard as a faction. I think Mortarion is probably the weakest Primarch character-wise, but I gotta say, they are really fun, and very important to me. This is supposed to be part 15 in a 20-part series I am doing covering important successor chapters in the modern setting of 40k. But like, there really isn't any important Thousand Sons successors out there other than like the group that Magnus is running and the group that Ahriman is running. I could talk about some random Zeech warband, but I don't think that's what you all are here for, so instead of following my own guidelines, I'm just gonna cover a fun kind of obscure moment in the history of the Thousand Sons and then tell you about a cool thing that happened. That's it. No chapter, but I hope you enjoy this video anyway, right? And if you don't just want to hear a cool moment and you want to hear about the Crystal Harbingers and how they're the coolest successors that no one's ever heard of, well, you can lick my whole ass, because I control the flow of media on this channel here, boyo, so do with that what you will. So, yeah. You guys remember that time that Magnus got into a battle with a Hecatoncheires like Gestalt Consciousness amalgamation and almost lost? Yeah, right? It's kind of cool. I don't even know what half of those words meant, but they were on the wiki, so I just decided to use them too because they sound cool. Lol, JK, don't worry, I actually did read the book involved with the thing I'm about to tell you about, but yeah. There is this joint custody occupation of a planet that happened once upon a time that was being evacuated during the Great Crusade. Basically, there was an extreme destabilization of the magnetic poles on the planet. Because of that, the world was basically being covered in endless firestorms and blizzards and shit. It was pretty dope. So Magnus the Red and his legion were tasked with evacuating the individuals who were occupying the planet. They were people who bent the knee to the Imperium, but due to some minor elements that rebelled, a Primarch was sent. These elements that rebelled were talking about how some ancient prophecy was about to be fulfilled, and that there was some massive entity, a godhead-style figure that was going to rise up and ascend this world to some kind of heaven. This entity was referred to as Shaitan, which, side note, the planet they were on was called Morningstar. You're not fucking clever, GW. I see what you're doing there. I think you should write more Leagues of Votann lore as recompense for what you just did. Or else. Okay, go on, I'm waiting. Regardless, Magnus also wanted to get to Morningstar as it had a lot of pre-Age of Strife literature in ruined libraries that he had to psychic his way to get to. You know,
warding his way through firestorms and shit in order to survive. It ended with him taking so long to evacuate everything that, as I mentioned, it became a joint effort when Magnus's BFF showed up, Perturabo, which is interesting to know that Magnus and Perty were the closest of each other's bonds, which I think is very interesting. I think there is some kind of joke, a metaphor here about Egyptians and Romans and whatever, but I'm not smart enough to make it. But if you read the Magnus Primarch book, you will see that they get along better than most other Primarchs get along, which is kind of cool. A lot of people think that Perturabo isn't even capable of being friendly, but he actually hugs Magnus in this book, which is kind of cute. There's even small moments where members of their legion start interacting and start realizing why they share a bond of some sort. But regardless, they end up working together to expedite the evacuation, but terroristic elements are starting to pop up all over Morningstar more and more, saying it is the will of Shaitan for people to die on this world. Bombs, guns, and Magnus being ambushed and shot point blank with a tank shell is a lot of what happened. Magnus ended up actually doing a lot to speed things up once the world was getting closer and closer to the end. And Perturabo also showed up, which definitely put a fire under his ass to do so. With some investigations, discussions with some weird mountain wizards, and Magnus going on walkabout for a little bit, just to get some intel, of course, he found out that whatever a Shaitan is, it's a real thing and is hidden in a ship that is older than the Imperium of Mankind. Basically, the original colonizer's ship that was sent up to Morningstar during the Dark Age of technology was buried far into the mountains, and whoever goes up there for some reason comes back different, or doesn't come back at all. So Magnus and a bunch of different Thousand Sons go up there to investigate. Upon arriving, they find a ship ancient and powerful, and inside it is occupied by an entity. A creature that is the combined minds of psychers that, due to some archaic torture method, were used to keep the horrors of old night away, which is why Morningstar was relatively untouched in terms of its populace. So, what did this entity look like? It didn't. It was intangible and ethereal, but it had the ability to possess any psychically gifted individual, which is really damn unfortunate that Magnus and his legion were the ones who found it. So Magnus ended up fighting against his own sons, with a few others that he brought with him who were a little more psychically powerful to fight off Shaitan. But Shaitan ended up actually possessing Magnus for like a short period and trying to force him to put Shaitan's consciousness inside of Magnus's body in order to exact its revenge on the Imperium for abandoning it. Eventually, Magnus ended up just overpowering it and then forcing it into the Book of Magnus, promising to tell its tale wherever Magnus would go, which is cool, and also kind of proves that Magnus is still one of the strongest psychers in the setting. But it is interesting to note that Shaitan actually overpowered Magnus for a little bit there. It is interesting to note that if Shaitan actually kept control over Magnus, that would make things kind of difficult, you know, giant psychic gestalt consciousness taking over the body of a Primarch hell-bent on revenge. That would definitely overshadow Horus a little bit, and a little early. So, yeah. And, yeah, that's more or less the whole story of Shaitan. Shaitan is an interesting creature, but I see not a lot of people talking about it. I know 40k Theories talked about it a while back, but I want to bring this up and see what everyone else thinks about it. Though I suppose this is a bit of a weird place to do that, because this is a video you have to pay to watch, and not as many people are going to see it unless I release this in its whole early, and I'm not going to be releasing this entire series for another 2 or 3 months as a... You know, I'm not going to think about that. That's fine. So, some final thoughts. I think a lot of people's first thought is to see Shaitan as a demon or some kind of warp entity, and I think that is both correct and incorrect at the same time. You dig? It's true that it is an entity made up of a hive mind of combined psychers, but something like that hasn't really ever been expanded upon, as the unshackled soul of a single psycher is immediately predated upon by warp beings and chaos monstrosities, so the idea that this actually exists is a bit odd. See, if there was a conglomerate of them, it would mean that the beacon for demons and demonic entities would be a lot brighter. So I like to think that this occupies the same categories as warp entities that existed before the warp was like so cloudy that it was hard for people to exist in. Like the Eldari used to be able to resurrect and reincarnate because the warp was just a pool for them to dive into and then come back if they went too far and died. And I remember in a few older books, which are probably not canon anymore, but in the original Emperor's backstory, he was part of the Shaman. The Shaman were this weird collective of psychers that were just early psychers for the Imperium of Mankind, and also probably a group of perpetuals that banded together in order to merge their consciousness into one being in order to fight off the demons that were slowly fight off. Wait, did we just accidentally get close to making a great value version of the Emperor? That sounds like what Shaitan was, but like ethereal and not a tangible being. Wait, if Shaitan possessed Magnus, does that mean we get another Emperor? Is that it? No, that's... We're not going to think about that, and that is going back in the vault for a little while, as I don't want to acknowledge that that is a thing.
Part 16 means one thing, and that is the Sons of Horus, the Black Legion, the greatest of the great and the worst of the worst. And one thing that not a lot of people tend to cover is the predecessors of the Sons of Horus, the Luna Wolves. There isn't much of a significant difference in the two, so I kind of get why they're usually lumped into the same category. But from my perspective, they do kind of divide the era of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy into pretty even halves. I think it is kind of an interesting thing to look at the journey they had to go on to become the arch traitors they ended up being. But yes, for those who don't know, the Luna Wolves have a weird legacy. See, with other legions, there is this idea that they either specialize in something or they are generalists. Those that specialize in something are sent on special missions that they are told they are the only ones who can do them. But with the generalists, they are usually good at everything to some degree, though not usually as peak in specific categories like the specialists are, so they are often sent on the most important and dangerous missions. Yeah, specialists tend to just be sent on busy work from what I've seen. But with generalist legions, I find that they are often sent off on the most important missions as they need to be handled with a degree of tact. If you were to take a generalist legion and put them up against a specialist legion, most of the times the generalist usually wins, though it is oftentimes pretty close. Like a good example is like the Ultramarines versus the Word Bearers, the Dark Angels versus the Night Lords. Kind of close in some areas, not really though, but you get what I mean. But the thing with the Luna Wolves is they are generalists, but with the skill in every area of that of a specialist. They are considered widely one of the strongest legions of all 20 for a reason. The only legion to compete would probably be the Dark Angels, but that's just because they actually have multiple divisions that are hyper-specialized in certain actions, which give them the ability to be considered generalists. The Luna Wolves, upon their inception as the first legion to have their Primarch, is one of the most interesting study topics in the early 30k setting, as they innovated several different tactics that are used by other legions, like the distribution of troops necessary to pull off the spear tip strike, where you take the strongest of your forces, put them in small pockets to lead the charge like a hammer blow to strike breaks and openings inside of enemy defenses so that the weaker and more baseline troops can make their way through the entrance that the spear tip made. That was popularized and perfected by the Luna Wolves. It's used in almost every legion's tactics to this day, and a lot of chapters still use it too. Further than that is that they revolutionized how Primarchs should interact with their legion, as the introduction of Horus was like steroids to their fighting capabilities. They fought harder, and the command structure that Horus implemented in the Luna Wolves was used in pretty much every legion afterwards, with modifications depending on special cases, all the way to the end of the legions as a concept. So what about Horus? Well, his relationship with the Legion has always been one of keeping himself grounded and not overstepping boundaries, while still playing the part of a politician. He even adopted an accent from Chthoniya, the home planet of his Legion that he doesn't even have. I remember him saying it was a slightly rural accent by choice so that he would appear a bit more trusting even to the upper echelons of the gang society from Chthoniya. He implemented this idea of the Mournival in order to keep himself grounded, which is super interesting as the purpose is to have 4 captains, or ranking officers, who all have opposing opinions, especially towards Horus, so that he could always have dissenting ideas that would help him make more informed decisions on topics. Each of them representing the waxing and waning phases of the moon, and thus the differences in personalities between each of them. It's pretty fun, and the ideas present are actually pretty concrete. Sure, the rough and tumble members of the Luna Wolves are a bit gang-like, but that's to be expected. So, what is this video even about? What I just discussed is an important aspect to them, but it kind of describes them in their entirety from all the information that we know. Well, the tagline of this video kind of plays into that, and it's the importance of names and symbols. See, the Luna Wolves were a bunch of Marines that worked with their Primarch Horus, but unlike every other Legion at that point, the name had only been of marginal significance. See, with the Space Wolves, their naming conventions were based off of the Wolves of Fenris, as well as Leman Russ, who was the wolf from space. The Night Lords got their name from, well, the fact that their leader is the Night Haunter, who is also a Lord of the Night. The White Scars are called as such because they all share the same scar as their Primarch Jagatai, as a show of solidarity, of course. So, with the pacification of Ulanor as a form of status symbol for the Luna Wolves, Horus was recommended to rename his legion as he was being placed at the head of all the other legions and being considered the Emperor's delegate in order to handle all affairs outside of his area, which would be the title of War Master, as we all know. And thus, the Sons of Horus were born, with the symbol of the Eye of Horus, which I think was the downfall moment for the Luna Wolves, as it removed the idea of Horus being a leader to his people, but still wanting to be a part of their society, and replaced it with Horus wanting to be a tyrant who is in charge of every single one of his legion with an iron fist. It's when the Sons of Horus were born that the legion began its true descent into the madness that inevitably would create the Black Legion. Its utter decay at the hands of Horus is incredibly interesting, I will say. It's why I find the Luna Wolves to be such an interesting idea, as they represent a style of legion change that you don't often see. The only time you can even compare it is to when a Primarch discovers his legion for the first time and changes their name, like how the Revenant Legion became the Blood Angels, the Star Hunters became the White Scars, and so on and so forth. But to have a name change so late in the game for the setting is almost unheard of. I don't think it's ever really happened to other legions, so it's left such an interesting impression. I know that some authors and readers of the fiction actually have this kind of relationship with the Luna Wolves as a whole. One of my favorites, and one of the best examples of what I'm talking about the difference between the Luna Wolves and the Sons of Horus, is that Aaron Dembski Bowden's significant other was kind of a fan of the Luna Wolves as they were getting into the fiction of the Horus heresy. So much so that they were a bit sad to see them turn into the Sons of Horus and see the downfall of it. So ADB, being ADB, used his weight at the company to add some lore to a successor chapter of Dorns in order to make them functionally the Luna Wolves in the modern setting. Which is also funny because canonically I'm pretty sure the Shadow Wolves, which is the chapter I'm talking about, also are like completely wiped out, though they probably got a Primaris chapter in the Ultima Founding, but I digress. So with the Luna Wolves being mostly dead, there is some representation, even in the modern day, as I'd be fucked to even remember this, but I remember there being a short story involving a stasis pod being recovered that had a Luna Wolf frozen in it, who was actually a member
before the Sons of Horus got corrupted, which is kind of interesting, but I doubt it's ever going to get any elaboration, as he was just some random dude. There is also the matter of Garviel Loken, who refused to identify as a son of Horus and chose to remain a loyal son of the Emperor as a Luna Wolf during the Horus Heresy, even while fighting other members of the Sons of Horus, which, again, is super interesting and incredibly complex. The importance of naming conventions and symbols cannot be understated, as in general, you need to have a symbol to rally behind if you are a soldier, which is why with the Luna Wolves, the icon of the wolf and the Emperor was the symbol, but with the Sons of Horus, it was Horus and the Eye of Horus, which kind of goes to show the shift in mentality as they changed over to the side of chaos. I think the Luna Wolves are cool as shit and have a little bit of modern day representation, as there is a faction of Sons of Horus successors that exist as a warband in the Eye of Terror that have taken the old Legion's colors, if I'm remembering correctly. Other than that, you just have the Black Legion, but Black Legion can kind of suck from time to time, so there's that. I will always play my hand pretty early when it comes to things that I don't feel 100% confident about. I have done a decent amount of research into the word bearers, though I definitely think I need to cover them a little bit more, but likely at a later date as I'm in the process of reading more and more about them. To be honest, from what I've seen, they don't seem to be a legion that was divided up too much by the fracturing of the Horus Heresy, though they may be divided into smaller groupings. In terms of warbands, they aren't really that different from one another. They still follow the same core teachings as the main legion, which makes it hard to talk about any of the supposed warbands without saying the exact same goddamn thing copy and pasted every single time I speak about them. So with that in mind, there's a few options I can go here. I could go the route of one of my favorite videos, which is the Promethean Kings, though I can't abuse that meme of a video archetype because it would get a little stale after a little bit. So what is another option? A good old theory crafting video. Basically, I want to discuss a few things about how to make your own warband for word bearers. This is partially inspired by Weshammer, that beautiful beard with a man attached to it, and his video about what it's like to be a traitor space marine, though he was mostly quoting a post by, I believe, Aaron Dembski-Bowden. It's still a good video and I'd recommend watching it. So, good on him for making something that inspired me. Gotta pay my dues every now and then, but regardless, what is there to know about making your own warband? A lot, and not much at all. People often come to me behind the scenes to ask advice for how to make a homebrew, and honestly, I'm kinda shitty at it. Like, for real, I am pretty bad at it. At least I think I am. So, to make this video a bit constructed, let's divide this into 3 segments. These segments are how I tend to make my own homebrew if ever I have a gun to my head and I need to actually come up with something. So these 3 parts are going to be the research, the theory crafting, and the end result. So let's start with the research part of things. When it comes to Warhammer and research, I tend to occupy the basic idea of you know only what you really need to know. So doing research into the word bearers can be as deep as the ocean or as shallow as a puddle. You can make things be as fantastical as you want, or just hone in on a single detail about the legion or a legion that you want to expand upon, which is what I tend to do. So let's pluck a random bit. So in the days pre-heresy and a little bit post-heresy, there was a lot of emphasis in the word bearers chapter structure, with each chapter of word bearers being dedicated to a different set of ideals and identities. In the modern day, there are still the smaller chapters that tend to adhere to the regular doctrine that the rest of the Legion does, but they do have slight differences, though it's become a bit more homogenized as things have progressed. One key piece of information I tend to love is that a minor cult that has arisen from this chapter structure in the word bearers are referred to as the Anointed.
You can be pulled from any of the Wordbearer's chapters or warbands or just divisions and be put into the Anointed, as they are kind of a smaller organizational, categorizational, cult-like thing in the Legion that kind of supersedes everything. They are the elites. The best way to think of them is essentially just the first company elites you'd see in other regular Loyalist chapters. These individuals wear relic Terminator armor and are often equipped with the best weapons a Space Marine can have. They are pretty high on the do not fuck with list side of things. So, we researched the Anointed, and we now have an idea. This idea is going to be based around the elite Terminator cult that exists in the Wordbearer's hierarchy. On to the next part. Now that we have kind of an idea of these elite Terminators, and know that they are the most hyper-dogmatic and religious of the bunch, we need to pick some themes and an identity for them. The main theme that the Wordbearers are known for is zealotry and dogmaticism, which I am only about 80% certain is actually a word. So let's hone in on that. What if our Wordbearer's warband is based on a small group of Anointed that branched off from the main group of the Legion, as they viewed the main Legion itself as losing their faith? Or maybe they were worshipping the wrong faith. Wouldn't it be cool if the warband in question, instead of worshipping all the gods and being chaos undivided, worshipped only one? Let's make it simple. Slow-moving, hyper-durable, long-lived Terminators, let's say they decided to jack this ability up to the maximum due to them making a pact with good old Papa Nurgle. Let's say that the small group of Terminators from the Anointed that branched off to form a Nurglite cult is only about 5 of these Terminators. So with 5 essentially Chaos Lords in charge, they still need an army of some sort, so where do they get it? Do they take them from other Renegade chapters? Probably not. Fun fact, the Wordbearers are pretty goddamn hated across the board as being rather annoying to work with, as they will pretty much screw over anyone in a heartbeat if it means gaining favor with the dark gods that they serve. So what would their army be? Humans, mortals. It's common knowledge that the Wordbearers tend to collect mortal followers in the form of cultists in order to seed cults across the Imperium. So if this small group of 5 Nurgle-worshipping Terminator lords seeded plague cults across the universe, they would just have a bunch of Nurgle zombies that could sing their praises and spread their doctrine as far as they would like. It isn't uncommon to have off-Legion worship of specific gods. You don't need to be a Death Guard member to worship Nurgle. A good example is the Purge, which is a small Nurglite warband of chaos-corrupted loyalist marines in the modern day that have nothing to do with the Death Guard. So why not key into that theme of them spreading lesser diseases in order to grab more and more followers rather than spreading diseases that would wipe out an entire population? They could have hordes and hordes of plague zombies, poxwalkers, and lesser demons. It would be pretty neat, as there is also a precedent for the followers of other cults of Wordbearers to use the zeal of other followers to clog and dismantle Space Marines. Think of it similar to that of ants dismantling a spider. They tend to understand that the biggest weakness a Space Marine has is multiple bodies climbing all over them. Even if they're weak and soft, a Space Marine can only move so fast and kill so many. So, unfearing men who are not afraid of the shock and awe tactics of a Space Marine are dangerous. Take that same concept, give them a disease that could actually possibly harm a Space Marine, and you're kind of in business there. So we have a bunch of ideas that were kind of thrown out there. Let's put it all together and see what we got.
Countless times do you bless your false emperor. Leave your other god that blesses you.
The Rotborn Priests are a Nurglite cult of word-bearers that command unending hordes of cultists, zombies, and lesser demons that focus on overwhelming others with the numbers of bodies they use. The infection starts simple. A single traveler will enter a town, a city, a hive. He will have pale skin and thick clothing to hide the lesions and blisters, as well as wraps to hide his patchy hair. He will somehow find a way to infect as many people as humanly possible upon collapsing in the town itself. The disease he carries is the shambling zeal. This disease worms its way into a person's brain and tells them to simply infect as many people as possible to spread the glory of Nurgle. The first day, maybe 5 people would be infected.
By the 5th day, thousands would have contracted at least traces. By the 7th, that is when the priests arrive. The Hand of Nurgle is what they are referred to as. 5 rotted Terminator suits of armor slowly march through the disease-stricken cities they now claim, to kill any remaining defenders who resist the call of Nurgle, for it is heresy to reject his gifts. They will defile places of safety and health, hospitals, sick bays, bomb shelters, anything that would be an affront to Nurgle. From there, they ransack for equipment and leave with a new mass of shambling corpses that, although resemble desiccated husks, constantly sing in perfect voices a hymn in the name of the Grandfather, and all that he has done for them and their families. Even if you listen close enough, you could never truly tell if they are laughing while singing or weeping. Whenever you talk about the successors of the Salamanders, there's always this running theme that it's hard to get them right. Not in like a metaphorical or an above game sense, because you just put a free hugs t-shirt on the scariest looking dude you have and make him legit nice, and boom, you have a successor to the Salamanders. It's really easy. It's more like, due to their highly mutagenic gene seed, it can cause and foster changes that come from the gene seed itself to go a little wonky, a little crazy, and a little, giant bone spiky. And thus, you get the Black Dragons. They are one of the funnest chapters that doesn't get talked about as much as I'd like, but they are still plenty well known due to them being, well, one of the older chapters, as they've been around since the early editions of the game. 2, they are from one of the most well-known foundings of Space Marines, the 21st, and 3, they have such a weird gimmick as a Space Marine chapter. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the simplest question, who are the Black Dragons? Simple. They are a successor of the Salamanders and a part of the Cursed Founding. What is the Cursed Founding, you might ask? Basically, it is a founding where allegedly fresh gene seed with a few extra templates was found by some cocksure tech priest biologist, and because of that, he thought his shit didn't stink, so he decided to tamper with it and try and improve upon what the Emperor did. Unfortunately, his name wasn't Belisarius Call, so he made a whole new founding with gene seed he messed with, and I think every single chapter that came out of this founding had something significantly wrong with them. And I mean very wrong with them. A lot of them are struck from the record due to them falling to chaos, but the ones that we do know about, the issues can range from as simple as, the Minotaurs being a bit too eager to listen to orders that would require the sacrifice of civilian casualties as well as other Space Marines, all the way up to, because you got rid of the Red Thirst, for some reason, in a Blood Angel successor, the Lamenters are now cosmically targeted by the universe itself to have the most bad luck and bad decision-making skills out there. In the middle of those two poles, you have the Black Dragons, who have a faulty os modula, which ain't that big of a deal in the long run of things. But what is the os modula? It's a gene seed organ that generates, strengthens, and modifies the bone structures of the body of a developing Space Marine. You know, it fuses the ribs, it makes everything tougher and stronger. If you have a weird mutation in that, it can do some wacky shit. The most standard thing that comes from the Black Dragons is every one of their Marines are standardly taller than the average Space Marine, due to their bones being much longer, which is in general a good thing all around, as it means they have longer muscle attachments as well as just an increased intimidation factor due to them being on average about 9 to 10 feet tall. The second interesting mutation that comes from this is that for some of their members, it doesn't stop at just the height increase as they develop more and more bones, turning into massive, deadly, pointy bone spurs that they use as weapons in their assault companies. I'm talking Baraka Claws from Mortal Kombat level shit, which is cool as all hell, but they also tend to have bony crowns of horns that pop up on their head from time to time. One common misconception about the Black Dragons is that they all have the weird bone spikes, but it's actually not all of them. Only some of them do, but I don't think we have an estimate on percentages here, as they often try to keep them
secret. Just know that they have both normal guys that are a bit taller and bony guys that are also pretty tall. Though it does make things a little bit easier to lore rep yourself on the tabletop, because you don't have to, model things with spikes all the time, so just running an entire Black Dragons army would be kind of cool. Speaking of, I love the color scheme of these Marines. I just wish that GW would add something else to them to make them stand out. I get you can't have anything be too different, and the bones would make them stand out enough. It's just a little difficult for me, who's a bit of a bonehead, pun, to model those kinds of spikes. I've tried it before for friends, because I'm the painter helper guy in my community, but it just never worked out. But let me learn you something when it comes to tabletop wargaming. There's this idea known as the 3-foot rule, which, if you don't know, means 99% of the time, whenever you put a miniature on the table, people are only going to see it from 3 feet away. So you don't have to go too wild or wacky on paint schemes, which is kind of important to know so you don't make every single miniature have intricate details and take hours to paint. Sometimes you can just slap them up and make them fine in less than a few minutes and be good. There is a detriment to that, though, where because of that specific rule and because you're only going to see miniatures from so far away, it's hard to make out the difference between the Black Dragons and the Iron Warriors and the Raven Guard, because they're all just a mono black paint scheme with maybe a different colored shoulder pad sometimes, or maybe a different colored knee pad. Something simple could make them pop a lot more and differentiate them so you don't get all 3 of them confused. Like, good example, the Black Consuls have a mono black paint scheme, but they have gold trim around their shoulder pads, which makes them super identifiable and cool. Unfortunately, the Black Dragons don't have that, but that's a nitpick for another day. The Black Dragons are also known for having incredibly pale skin, which is interesting because they are of Salamander's gene stock, though I know that once exposed to the nocturne sun, it can cause the weird hyperchromatic pigmentation thing that the Salamanders have. The Inquisition tends to send members to keep an eye on them, as something that fucked up looking probably has something going on that they probably shouldn't. But this usually ends with said Inquisitor finding out that, no, not really actually, they are in fact just on the level good guys. Like, they are just nice. Through and through, they're Salamander successors, what can you expect? It reminds me of how the Ultramarines love all of their successors, but they are always casually just kind of nervous about the Mortifactors, because they are a bunch of bone-collecting weirdos. So regardless, the Black Dragons have not much else to be said, aside from that one little jaunt they had with the Dark Eldar, as it ended with them being tortured for God knows how long. One being shot with the Boninator gun, which the Dark Eldar have for some reason, and turned them into a bone dragon, which is now a wall decoration. One of these individuals ended up leaving. The Black Dragons survived. It was cool. He ended up getting recruited by the Salamanders to be a part of their scout company for a little bit, and that's really interesting. Just imagine you're on Nocturne getting trained to protect the universe and you have this thing working next to you. It's kind of funny, but I do like them a lot for it. And the final nail in the coffin that is the oddity that they represent is the fact that they are actually Codex compliant in terms of their chapter hierarchy as well as their company structure, which is just funny to me on a meta-contextual sense. Like, the Ultramarines successors routinely have issues trying to stay loyal to the Codex and remain compliant, but for some reason, the Bone Dragon Monster chapter that is constantly under supervision by the feds is going to somehow follow Big Bobby G's rulebook of fun and tactical engagements. That's cool. They're neat. The Black Dragons represent a kind of weird spot for the Salamanders, as they show that the majority of their successors are going to be weird, and there aren't too many to show from. But we do have some good options in the Ultima Founding, which I might do a 3-hit combo of for the Salamanders at some point, because all of the successor chapters that came out of that were pretty fun. I can only think of 3 right now, but I know there's probably a few more. I know off the top of my head, I've got the Dark Krakens, the Black Vipers, and the Dragon Spear, and all of those are just wild, and I wouldn't want it any other way. So yeah, I want to cover those at some point, though interestingly enough, I don't know if there's enough to make an individual video about them, so making a group video about them would be kind of fun and easy.
This one's weird. And I know I say that a lot for these videos, but this one truly is going to be a bit of an outlier because it's not so much a video about a Space Marine chapter that I think is interesting, and more so how fandom intersects with the creation of a Space Marine chapter. So, much to my editor's chagrin, there is, no art for this chapter, at all, as they occupy a niche that a lot of people have been asking about, and because of that, there isn't really many people who want to draw for it. It's complicated, but you'll understand in a second. Well, not really. You'll understand in, a few minutes, because there's going to be a bit of a point that I need to make, but... yeah. This question that I mentioned earlier that people have been asking, and by people I mean 5 to 10 comments that I've read, is that are fan chapters ever made canon? Or are chapters that fans came up with made into a canon chapter that's expressed in the lore? And the answer is surprisingly yes, but the hoops you need to go through in order to accomplish that is actually pretty wild. The Iron Ravens are an odd chapter of Marines. As this is part 19, you could probably assume by their name, as well as the 19, that they're part of the Raven Guards as a successor chapter of them. And, that's true. I'm going to lay my cards on the table here and let you know that there is a lot of conflicting information about this chapter, even though there isn't that much information about them in general. But I think it's interesting as it kind of furthers the point that I want to make about these individuals. So why is it that they're kind of interesting? Because they are a chapter that was mentioned in lore around 2017, 2018, I believe, where in a short audio drama that was released, I believe, explicitly only on Black Library, they were mentioned as a second founding chapter of the Raven Guard, which is nothing to scoff at. Second founding chapters are kind of important to the setting, but that is kind of all that is brought up about them in that audio drama. So cut to around 2019, the folks down at Games Workshop are putting together this glossary of artists that work with them and their fan content to promote the revised 8th edition codex for Space Marines that was coming out towards the later end. See, they started releasing too many Space Marine units and didn't understand that they could just update the online records at that point, so they had to release a second codex, and oh man, people were mad. But regardless, they wanted to promote people's fan chapters and provide rules in the book to allow people to make their own chapters, which is always fun. The rules were bad, but they were there, and I like that they're there. I don't care if rules are good, I just care that they're there. So one of the things that was promoted was some lad named Paul Norton, who was a heavy metal painter, or heavy metal painter at the time, chose this as his chapter and gave a breakdown of the lore that he came up with for GW and, the approved stuff that he was allowed to talk about in, I believe a White Dwarf, as well as mentioning their lore in the codex itself. Comically enough, GW also allowed him to speak in sort of an interview style format on their YouTube channel. The video's up still right now, and the video is especially funny because he contradicts himself in the video in kind of a big way, where in the first half of the video he says that they are a second founding successor chapter of the Raven Guard, and then the last half he refers to them as a new chapter comprised entirely of Primaris Marines that served in the Unnumbered Sons of Guilliman. So that's kind of a contradiction, but there is a way to rectify it, because it could be the same situation with, say, the Soul Drinkers, where it's inferred in a recent short story, I say recent as if it wasn't just within the last 5, maybe 10 years, that they may be a second founding successor chapter of the Imperial Fists after all. But as they were all wiped out, and with no remaining Soul Drinkers left, there was an Ultima founding refresh chapter that took on the same name and the burden of being, Sons of the Imperial Fists. I doubt it's that. It's probably just some dude speaking out his ass about his cool Space Marine chapter that he liked so much and just got a little bit too excited and didn't articulate himself very well, which is cool. Have you seen me on live stream? That's just me. I do that all the time. But it also just gave him an excuse to talk about his cool paint scheme. And it is a really cool paint scheme. I like the look of the Iron Ravens. It's very distinct, especially for Raven Guard successors. To get into it and actually discuss their lore rather than discussing their backdrop, these guys occupy a similar niche to the Shadow Wolves, where they don't have a lot of lore, rather they didn't, but the dudes at GW allow one of their employees every now and then to write lore for a chapter that has nothing in it, you know? So what do we know about the Iron Ravens? So, for one, their paint scheme is actually very important to distinguish their rank, which is not often done outside of company markings. The more blue that is on an Iron Raven's scheme, the higher rank they are, with the highest ranked individuals from the first company or ranking officers for each, you know, like captains and lieutenants and so on, having completely blue arms as well as a bunch of different blue trim across their entire body. Alongside that, there is various different gradations for markings in terms of helmets. They stress a lot in the lore that there is very complicated patterns painted onto their helmets to denote if you are a captain, lieutenant, sergeant, and so on. And I think it's very interesting in terms of a peacock sort of aesthetic, where bright colors and whatnot. This is likely because, as it's mentioned in their lore, they are a Codex-compliant chapter that also served in the Unnumbered Sons of Guilliman. And realizing that markings for chapter shenanigans are kind of important, as well as important to just the cultural choices of a chapter. Also, because they served with the Unnumbered Sons, they actually don't do the sneaky shit the Raven Guard are known for. Well, it's still sneaky, but it's sneaky in the same way a stealth bomber with a high-yield nuclear device is sneaky, where their whole sneaky shit kind of begins and ends with setting up without people knowing that they're there on high. So, their whole gimmick is shock assault, but so are Space Marines. Most Space Marines, their whole gimmick is just doing the shock assault thing, right? But these guys are kind of more shocky assault, where they set up in a place of complete stealth, usually in low orbit, with as many drop pods, as many Marines, and as many stealth bombers as they possibly can. And all at once, when their opposing army is least likely to know, they drop everything. The entire chapter goes down. It's a hammer blow instead of just prolonged combat. It's still very Raven Guardy in principle, as there is a lot of stealth setup and reconnaissance that needs to be done in order to get this done. But as I mentioned, there's just the lack of that prolonged assault kind of thing, right? It's cool. It's a different kind of stealth. It's the kind of stealth of, like, instead of an assassin hiding in the shadows with like a poisoned dagger, it's more like me hiding behind a corner with a ball peen hammer. It's kind of nice. It's cute that they're kind of interpreting the tactics that way. They are an odd chapter of Marines for this, as this trait of shock assault into the middle of enemy territory, although is cool, and I have been kind of gassing it up, it is shared by a few other chapters, though right off the top of my head I could name one, and that's the Emperor's Spears, that do relatively the same thing, but have this weird way of going about it where they crash in like a wave, then fall back before crashing in again, sort of back and forth. The term for this, the name of this specific tactic for the Emperor's Spears, is called Redden the Earth, or in their language, if you've read the books, it's Skovakara Ulzarun, which kinda hype, but you know. So, fun fact, also, the name of this version of the tactic that the Iron Ravens use is called the Blade of Korax, which is kinda cool as a name. It sounds like a high-level drop in World of Warcraft, but I digress. And yeah, that's kinda it. They were kind of featured prominently in the later half of 8th edition Space Marine stuff, as well as some of the early stuff for 9th edition, and I'm pretty sure if you go to your codex for Space Marines or go to the rulebook of 40k right now and go to the open play section, you'll find rules for them, or at least like mentions of them, because they were kind of the poster boys for Play It Your Way, which is, I don't know, I feel like that's kind of backhanded to Paul Norton and his like lore, but like whatever. I like open play, but not a lot of people do, I suppose. It was part of this kind of push that GW does every now and then when they see backlash starting to kind of happen to them promoting the Ultramarines a little bit too much, aside from other chapters, where GW essentially stands up and does the tried and tested, oh, you don't like the blue guys? Well, here's some new blue guys. And then they'll usually show an image of like the Crimson Fists or like some other blue-ish chapter or some kind of successor chapter to the Ultramarines. I know it's a hyperbolic statement, but like that's kind of what I mean. So they do that every now and then when people complain too much about Ultramarines. As cynical as I am, I do think it's overall a good thing. I think GW trying to push custom chapters is a good way of promoting the idea of making chapters in the minds of others. I feel like it's swept to the side a lot that you have very limited options to make Space Marines. Even, like, if you acknowledge the fact that there's technically 1,000 chapters of Marines, I still think that it's important to let people know that you could just make whatever you want, because I think we only have records for somewhere between 400 and 700 Marines that are loyalists serving Marines. And I think promoting other chapters chapters other than Space Marines and giving them the limelight of any kind is a good idea. Like, good example as to what I'm talking about, how sometimes GW can hit the nail on the head, is that right now for Age of Sigmar, the 4.0 version of the game is not actually promoting the Hammers of Sigmar, which are the gold and blue guys that you see on all of the promotional material. It's actually a different subsection of the Stormcast Eternals, which is the Hallowed Knights, which is cool because I play the Hallowed Knights. So seeing that, I immediately thought it was an insta-buy because I really like them. Sure, they still promote the Hammers of Sigmar, but they're trying something different to see if it brings more people in, and I think that's very interesting. I appreciate that. Even in small ways for 40k, they do still do it from time to time, even if it's just something as simple as, oh, here's a new Black Templars model or some shit like that. Because fans tend to take it into their own hands, it is nice for them to remind us that it's possible and that they still support it. I think that the Iron Ravens are a fun chapter as they represent the idea of GW letting people put info down on a place that really doesn't have much info anyway. I think they should do that more often. I think it would be really cool if each Black Library writer was allowed a single funny chapter with absolutely no lore and maybe a single sentence to write about, and then put a little bit of sauce into it. Could you imagine if Guy Haley just started writing about the fucking Hawk Lords? I like the Hawk Lords. They're just Emperor's children, but not, which is cool. I know ADB got the Emperor's spears for this express purpose, but I genuinely think that having a lot more of random obscure chapters getting a little bit of a rewrite is always really fun. It's why one of my favorite books of the last 10 years for Games Workshop is definitely the Successors anthology, as it just talks about a bunch of random chapters that are just have no lore. Like, there's an Angels Resplendent / Angels Penitent section of that book, which who the hell talks about Angels Penitent? That's awesome. The Iron Ravens stand as a testament to a very specific style of Marine that has only really been shown recently, which is the Primaris only chapter. I say recently, again, when I say recently, like last 5 years. Please be patient with me. But also maybe the Primaris rebirth of a dead chapter. I think it could be cool to see like the Star Scorpions come back in a similar way. Another 20-part series done. I think you all would agree it's been a hell of a ride. To think my channel has grown so much after the year, it's kind of wild. The first one of my members videos was uploaded on the 16th of August, and now you've all become quite the large collective, a massive community of people who get what I hope you guys think is worth it. I appreciate the support from the bottom of my heart. I really, really do, because without your help, I wouldn't be able to do this. So, I just wanted to say thank you before I actually get into the video. But enough of me being kind of an emotional little bitch, and let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. And what is that? Well, considering I want to ride this joke into the sun, I'm going to be covering the greatest successors of the Alpha Legion, the Alpha Legion. Yeah, I'm just gonna keep doing this until it gets boring, which it's already probably done that already, but I digress. Today is mostly dedicated to discussing the reasons why people are so fascinated with the Alpha Legion, because for a Legion that doesn't get much of the spotlight in the lore, there is an incredibly pervasive aura about them that attracts the weird conspiracy nuts of the 40k community. I swear, if GW ever had their stock prices dip to a critical low and they wanted to sell out and say, you know, the hell with integrity, they could just have Gilliman lean forward to one of his prime iterators and just say, I am Alfarius, without further explanation, and the fandom would lose their goddamn minds. So I just wanted to make a more theoretical video about, well, why? Why do people care so much? And I do actually have a definitive answer for this. And it's going to fly in the face of some rather interesting fan theories I've seen before, but you know, it is what it is. Starting off, for those not in the know, the Alpha Legion are a legion with a very specific specialism. A lot of people say stealth or espionage, but those are really only half answers. The best way to describe it, or at least the best way that I tend to describe it, is they are a legion whose sole concern in terms of warfare is the control of the flow of information. As if you control what people know about you, your strengths, your weaknesses, you can play into it, and win almost all the time just because no one knows what is your weakest point and what is your strongest. This has led them to become so deep undercover that people tend to think most things the Alpha Legion does are just, well, a psyop of some sort. They have to be smarter than everyone, right? Especially the other Space Marines, if that's their main gimmick, is being smarter. I disagree, so let's take this somewhere wild. The most well-known fear is the fear of the unknown. It's been stated by every single hack horror commentary YouTuber out there at some point or another, and it does bear a lot of truth, but I think the biggest joy in life is on the opposite end of the same coin, which is mystery and surprise. People enjoy not knowing something in the same way that you don't know what a finished puzzle looks like as you're working on it. The hidden ideas and identities involved in the Alpha Legion is very much an interesting point of contention, where I think the majority of the appeal for them is the mystery of what their intent is. They were working in tandem with this massive alien organization known as the Cabal. They are an organization dedicated to the destruction of chaos at any cost. They informed the twin Primarchs of Alpharius and Omegon that in the coming rebellion of the Horus Heresy, which was unavoidable, if they sided with Horus, they would lead to an unprecedented victory for the traitors, to completely killing the Emperor, destroying all of humanity, and after that there would be massive civil wars between all of the traitor legions. This would mean that the primary food source of chaos would disappear, and they would eventually be starved out and die after a few thousand years, leading to the other species of the universe being able to take hold of it once again. But if they sided with the Emperor, he would be only mortally wounded, and the Imperium would basically rally under him as a martyr, causing chaos to have an almost infinite supply of emotional energy to feed itself indefinitely and eventually destroy every species and thing in this universe. The fun part here is that outwardly the majority of the Alpha Legion sided with Horus. They're even in the Chaos Codex in the modern day, while doing it under the guise of allegedly trying to side with what Alpharius believed was the Emperor's final goal of eliminating chaos completely. But even still, with them siding with Horus, the opposite happened, where the Emperor was mortally wounded. Now, say what you will about Alpharius doing one thing and Omegon doing another, which is why it's kind of open to interpretation, I mind you. But that's the reason there is such a high level of fan theories and intrigue in this specific faction. Content involving the Alpha Legion is always speculative about why this specific thing happened. Now, the easiest way to explain it is Omegon just outplayed Alpharius and ended up causing more of the Alpha Legion resources to be dedicated to the Loyalist side, which ended with the bad end of the war, where there was no civil war after the Horus Heresy that would destroy all of humanity, and the Emperor was just mortally wounded. But I do think that there is a lot of wiggle room for people to interpret it that maybe it was a mixed victory, where both sides ended up getting a little bit of something in the end. People love a good puzzle, and piecing everything together with just the limited pieces of information they have is definitely fun. The characters of the Alpha Legion are also, although not nearly as highlighted as the other legions during the Heresy, incredibly fun. I love my experiences with individuals like Ingo Peck, even if I have to stomach the fact that John Grammaticus shows up in his story. This doesn't just translate to them in the Heresy. Even in the modern day, there are events like, say, Saint Celestine giving an Imperial relic to a group of Alpha Legionnaires because she thinks that they are still loyal to some degree. Or with the events of Militant Apostolic Matthew in the Dark Imperium trilogy, where the Alpha Legion slaughtered an entire planet of priests that are being trained only to leave him intentionally alive, which inevitably, coupled decades later into the future, led to him being possessed by the spirit of the Emperor for a temporary period of time and saving the life of Rabute Gilliman while banishing Mortarion for an extended period of time. Mortarion is still not back in the story if my memory is correct, and that is a very significant benefit to the Imperial side of things. These actions, although definitely not conventionally pleasant, do end up with the greater good for the Imperium being accomplished, which is kind of the highlight
highlight of the Legion as a whole due to things that Omegon has been kind of cooking for the last couple hundred centuries. Because if you didn't know, Omegon of the two Primarchs was actually the one deemed to be just straight up loyal for the most part, allegedly. It's kind of hard to tell, but he was the one to tip off a lot of loyalists during the heresy in very indirect ways. He was the one that planned a lot of those actions that, because the Alpha Legion attacked this key point, other Imperials figured out really quickly that, oh, he's actually a traitor, and they ended up attacking with double the force. It's very suspicious, but with Alfarius being the one who ended up dying, Omegon is technically the only Primarch left for the Alpha Legion, which would explain why a lot of their behaviors kind of lead to a greater good for the Alpha Legion and the Imperium as a whole. Though again, there's a lot to interpret here. I do think they are also just fun, and the reason why people like them is because they're just kind of cool. It doesn't have to be that deep. You can be as superficial about them as you like. Like, straight up, I just like the color of their armor and their tactics. That's it. You don't have to enjoy their lore. But because aesthetically they look cool, lore-wise they have a lot to them, and there's just a lot of puzzles that people come back to trying to solve, especially when we get new information. I think that it leads to this complete package that people just genuinely enjoy, even down to their armor scheme requiring a completely different technique of painting to use. Like, I learned about inks and using inks through the Alpha Legion, where you have to, I know this isn't a painting channel, but you paint them a bright silver and then you have to overlay a turquoise ink over them to give them this kind of bright blue metal look to them. I think that's so interesting that they're very different. It's kind of like the Night Lords, where you have to learn how to paint the lightning in order to use them. There are numerous reasons as to why the Legion is so popular, and that is why I think even if the joke runs stale, I'm always going to have something to say about them. Like, hey, did you guys know that I picked up Legions Imperialis? You know, the mini Warhammer. And I'm currently painting my Space Marines in that set as Alpha Legion. Ain't that nutty?
That was 20 chapters of Space Marines that I think are significant enough to justify talking about. Was it a stretch? For some of them, yeah. But I like to think I pled my case well enough. I have my favorites, and if I may be a bit sappy, it's so weird to think that I can trace myself back to seeing the first video of this series and know that it was a year ago. If I remember correctly, I did this around 25,000 subs, but I could be wrong. And that was an amazing climb. A big growth rate for me, for any channel, to be honest. I love doing this. I love entertaining people, and I love being able to do this for a job, so I try to monetize things only as far as to make my content better and support myself. I'm used to being poor, like full-on broke most of the time, eating nothing but pasta and canned sauce and peanut butter sandwiches on stale bread with a side of shitty cereal in the morning. But because of this channel and the support of you guys, I am about to move out of my current place and into an actual apartment. I'm currently renting out a single 7x9 room with like no openable windows and no AC. I honestly could never have gotten here without any of you, and that's not just because of like channel members. I want to thank every single person who watches my channel, even if you're just a subscriber to someone who just happened upon this video and decided to be fun to watch. I think a lot of content creators forget that and just end up seeing their fans as dollar signs and only thanking the ones that support them financially. But without any of you, this channel wouldn't exist, and my ability to produce videos, hire on someone to work for me, it wouldn't be what it is now, and I wouldn't be able to do it. So I want to try and interact with you all as much as possible. I ground myself by reading as many comments as possible when a video goes live, and from there I'm able to understand what people like and what people are feeling. It's not much, but it helps me understand when people like certain videos and people don't like certain videos, but it helps me understand what your opinions are. Side note, I have a public Discord. The link is in the description of all of my videos, and I do try to hop in VC from time to time, though it does get kind of rare. I am a bit busy this time of year. So if you got to the end of this video, show up. We might get to hang out at some point, because I do hang out in there from time to time. But from the bottom of my heart, all of that aside, thank you all for being here. thank you especially to my channel members, as because of all of you, my life has not just improved, but gotten better than I thought it ever could have been. Here's to new content coming around the corner, and once again, thank you all for watching. Until next time.